The warlord summoned Urza at once when he returned to the Argivian camp. As the artificer entered the warlord's tent, the ruler was seated in his camp chair, flanked by the captain of the guard and Rusko. "Your brother is fansThe," spat the warlord. Urza shook his head. "My brother is not fansThe, but he serves the Qadir as I serve you." "Why did you not tell me?" demanded the sovereign. "Until today, I didn't even know he was still alive," returned Urza. "I see," said the warlord, leaning back in his camp chair. Rusko, watching quietly from his side, thought the ruler did see, though not necessarily what Urza intended. The warlord's enemies had an ally obviously every bit as talented as his son-in-law. The taste of that revelation was sour. "What has he been doing with them?" asked the warlord. "I do not know," returned Urza, shrugging expressively. "How did he end up with them?" continued the warlord. His feet kicked restlessly at the stool in front of him. "I do not know," repeated the chief artificer. "What can that mechanical behemoth do?" demanded the warlord. His voice was rising in volume, and Rusko felt the temperature in the tent growing hotter. Urza held up his hands before him to show his lack of knowledge. "We spoke of it only briefly." The warlord rubbed his lower lip. His fingers came away, stained with blood. "Here's one I hope you can answer. Can you build one like it?" Urza thought for a moment. "Probably, if I get a chance to examine it. Mishra says that he found it in the desert, but it is much more advanced than any Thran device I've ever seen. I do not think it is Thran at all." The warlord muttered, half to himself, half to the captain and Rusko. "We have patrols scouring the sand for stones, and his brother finds an ancient mechanical behemoth, fully functional. He says he found it," said Urza stoically. "I don't know if that's the truth." "You don't know if your brother is truthful," said the warlord quickly, raising an eyebrow. "I didn't say that either," said Urza hotly. We did not part on the best of terms." "So Rusko has told me," said the warlord. "Later, we will talk, he and I," offered Urza. "If there is a later," said the chieftain, shaking his head. "These fansThe played a trick on us with their behemoth. We were prepared to show them our power, demonstrating our ornithopters and the mechanical man. Instead they roll up with a legendary beast the size of a ship. The Argivians are all ready to bolt, and the coalitions want to thank everyone for coming. Take the ornithopters and go home. No, those desert raiders aided by your brother pulled a fast one on us, and we have to respond." Urza did not question the warlord's words, even when he was dismissed, and Rusko and the young captain remained behind. He did not even visit the ornithopters, which were the hub of much additional activity. Instead, he went to his own quarters and lay in his hammock, waiting for the meetings to begin and for a chance to see his brother again. A table had been set up beneath the pavilion, four-sided, with great chairs on three of the sides. The one on the west was occupied by the warlord, flanked by Urza and the mechanical man. The ocean ruler's mood had not improved since his talk with Urza, and the old man seemed on the verge of exploding. The chair on the south was occupied by the Lord of Corlus, flanked by two mercenary guards from different units. The eastern chair was occupied by a nervous Argivian diplomat, with two equally nervous bureaucrats at his side. The northern seat was a low bench, desert-style, set for the fansThe Qadir. He arrived in his litter and half-rolled, half-waddled onto his seat. He was supported by Mishra on one side, and the red-haired staff-wielder Ashnod on the other. The falange had left the brass behemoth back at the camp, though. Its serpentine neck was clearly visible behind them. The Corlesian lord began the meeting softly. "We welcome the representatives of the falange to the conference. I hope we may be able to resolve matters that have vexed us all individually, and to come to a mutually beneficial compromise." "With your kind permission," interrupted Mishra on behalf of his most eminent Qadir, "I have a statement to read." The Corlesian lord's mouth flapped open for a moment. Then she nodded. The warlord sputtered a protest. Mishra began without further encouragement, his words louder than the complaining warlord. "We, the falange people, welcome the opportunity to speak with the men of the eastern coastlands. Know that we are a unified people under our Qadir, and our empire stretches from Tomikul to the Argivian border, from ice-fed Ronim Lake to the warm Zigoni coast. We are many gathered together, and as such we are mighty. Whatever else may be decided by this conference, we must make clear that it is our ultimate goal to regain all the land of the falange people, and to protect that land and the resources that it contains from all invaders, raiders, and would-be conquerors." The warlord started at the words and interrupted with the snarl. "Not a bad little speech for a race of invaders, raiders, and would-be conquerors. Do the people of Tomikul and Zigon agree with your statements, or are they just waiting for someone to strike your young puppy of a Qadir across the snout on their behalf?" Mishra raised an eyebrow at the interruption, and even Urza was surprised by the heat of the warlord's words. He put a hand on the ruler's shoulder to calm him. However, it was the Qadir who answered, in the clipped accent of an Argivian. "Have a care, old man. You do not wish to cross me." Urza looked at Mishra, and Mishra nodded back at his brother. The Qadir had learned Argivian from his Raki and knew enough to realize when he was being insulted and to respond in kind. The warlord would not be dissuaded. "Have a care yourself, child warrior. Do not trifle with those who possess more experience and wisdom than you." Urza started to speak. Perhaps now would be a good time to adjourn and think about, but the Qadir was already talking again. "Do you know who I am?" demanded the young falange. "I am the Qadir of the Suwardi tribe. Once, long ago, we lived in the Suwardi lands north of Yosha. You called them the Suwardi marches." "The sword marchers," shot back the warlord. "When I was a younger man, we cleaned that land of raiders and brought true civilization to it. It is Suwardi land and belongs to the falange people," snapped the Qadir. "There have not been any Suwardi there since your great-grandfather's age," rejoined the warlord hotly. "Yes," hissed the Qadir. "You drove my great-grandfather from our land. My grandfather wandered the empty wastes. My father gathered the tribes. And now I come to you with my empire at my back and demand the return of my family's land." Urza looked at Mishra, but his brother had a blank expression on his face. Could it be he had not known about the Qadir's demands? The Corlesians and the Argivians were talking as well now, as chaos erupted at the table. "You are an old fool," continued the Qadir with a contemptuous sneer, "to hope to prevail in the face of our obvious power." "I'll show you what I know of power," replied the warlord. "Take a lesson, child." The warlord made a gesture. The captain of the guard, waiting outside the pavilion, turned, raised his hand, and then dropped it. Out by the ocean camp, Roscoe turned and waved to the ornithopter crews, already at their machines. In a matter of moments the sky around the pavilion was heavy with the beating of great canvas wings. The flight of 11 ornithopters, lacking only Urza's new one with its double-bent wings, came in low over the pavilion. The Qadir looked up in shock, but Mishra was already next to him, shouting something in Falange. Urza was yelling at the warlords. "Well, what is this?" the artificer roared. "Why am I ornithopters in the air? Why wasn't I told? It's a lesson in power." The warlord shouted in return, his teeth bright like a shark's. "You would do well to pay attention to it as well." The ornithopters banked over the pavilion and made a beeline toward the Falange camp. 3 of the craft banked right and 3 veered left. The remaining 5 headed straight for the dragon engine. Small objects fell from the ornithopters, jettisoned by the pilots. They were black bits of shadow that plummeted into the Falange camp. Where they landed, the ground erupted in explosions of flames and smoke. There were screams as the flames spread, and more bombs dropped. Urza shouted, but his voice was drowned in another round of explosions. The 5 ornithopters that bore down on the dragon engine glided in low, trying to fling the bombs along the base of the great metallic creature. A string of eruptions blossomed beneath the beast, and it wheeled and gave a metallic scream, but seemed otherwise unhurt. The dragon engine exhaled a huge gout of reddish mist directly in the path of one of the ornithopters. As the craft passed through it, the ornithopter came apart in midair. Its wings folded upon itself, and it crashed among the tents, releasing a larger gout of flame as the rest of its deadly cargo exploded. Within the pavilion, reaction among the delegates was instantaneous. The Argivians flung themselves under the table. The Corlesian mercenaries grabbed their lord, one by each arm, and dragged her backward, away from the table, while she shouted orders and obscenities at him. The warlord was laughing now, taunting the young Qadir. The Falange ruler rose from his bench with a speed that surprised Urza. His hand lashed out. The warlord saw the blow coming and tried to lean away from it, but the youth was too quick. Before either brother could react, a curved blade jutted from the old man's chest, blood spouting from the wound like a fountain. "No!" shouted Urza, and felt his Mightstone heavy on his chest. He laid one hand upon it, and with the other activated his mechanical humanoid. "Stop him!" Urza shouted. The mechanical man lurched forward and grabbed the Qadir by the front of his robes. The young man let out a choked cry as inhumanely long arms reached across the table and snared him with fingers of iron, root, and metal. Simultaneously, the red-haired woman lowered her staff and pointed it at Urza's metallic creation. Lightning danced along the dolphin skull, and Urza felt a wave of nausea pass over him. It felt as if every part of his skin had become acutely sensitive. The movement of the breeze inflicted horrible pain. Gritting his teeth, Urza barked another command, and the mechanical being pulled the Qadir toward itself. Across the corner of the table, out on the battlefield, the Falange were attempting to regroup. Mishra had signaled his dragon engine, and now the beast's serpentine neck dodged and darted among the diving ornithopters. It caught one and flung it to the ground, the canvas wings catching fire as it did so. On the ground, the Yotian troops charged, trying to kill any falange who escaped, though. Bombing. Some of the Corlesian mercenaries joined them in the assault. Ashnod shouted, and Mishra turned to see the Qadir in the grip of the metal man. He spun toward the dragon engine to signal one last command, then wheeled to face Urza and his mechanical creation. Mishra gripped a thin hide pouch around his own neck, and green lambent power leaked out between his fingers. He concentrated that power on Urza's machine. Urza caught the backwash of the energies and staggered. The mechanical creation was more greatly affected. Sparks danced at its joints, and steam began to seep from beneath its helmeted face. Its fingers loosened, and the Qadir dropped free, clutching his throat and gasping for breath. Ashnod shouted something, and Mishra nodded. Suddenly the northern side of the pavilion was shattered as the dragon engine smashed its way onto the raised platform. Ashnod let her staff down, and its fires died. She tucked the staff under one arm, grabbing the Qadir with the other, and dragged the ruler toward the engine as if he were no more than a puppet. Urza felt the pain subside. He focused his Mightstone at his metal creation. Mishra, he shouted, his head still spinning. We have to stop this. Dimly he heard his brother's voice snarl back, so you can betray us again, brother. Urza started to reply, I didn't know, but the stress of the Mightstone and Weakstone proved to be too much for the mechanical beast between the brothers. It exploded at the waist, its torso spinning around its central pivot and its head jutting flames. Urza screamed as the flames arched around him. The last thing he saw was Mishra running back toward his dragon engine, his creation framed by a wreath of smoke from the ornithopter bombs. The searchers found Urza in the shattered pavilion, cradling the dead body of the warlord, the blasted legs and hips of his mechanical humanoid still stood next to him, the fragments of its head and torso scattered around the lopsided platform. The captain of the guard arrived and saluted. The enemy is in full retreat, sir. Urza said nothing, and the captain continued. We inflicted heavy casualties on the falange troops with minimum losses to our own. We lost 4 ornithopters in the attack. Several of the Corlesian mercenaries joined in the assault and want to be paid for the contribution. The Argivians have already fled without drawing a sword. Urza looked in the pale, quiet face of the captain as the soldier continued. The enemy leader and he paused, your brother, have escaped with their engine into the mountains. We will scout for them with the remaining ornithopters. Urza said something softly that the captain could not hear. Beg pardon, sir? He asked. I just asked why, said Urza sadly, looking at the warlord's face. Why did he do this? You heard the falange devil, the captain said. They wanted to invade Yotia, to regain land they lost generations ago. It's the desert way, carrying grudges for generations. No, said Urza, his voice now filled with steel. He was ready for this. This ambush. The ornithopters. The bombs. Goblin powder, wasn't it? The warlord was preparing for an attack all the time. It should have been a massacre. If not for my brother's engine, it would have been. The captain of the guard shifted uneasily but said nothing. And why did he not tell me? Asked Urza bitterly. Why not tell me he was going to use my machines like this? The captain stammered. I couldn't say, sir. Urza laid the body of the warlord on the shattered floor of the pavilion and turned toward the captain. "Yes, you can say," Urza said icily. "You can say everything you know." "Who knew about this? What were the full plans? What did you hope to accomplish? Why did you not tell me? Why did you not tell the princess?" "You can and will answer those questions." The captain shifted his feet uneasily. "Because," Urza continued, turning back to the body, "because I have to go back to Krug now and tell my wife her father is dead. And I will need all the reasons I can muster to make her understand. Because I don't understand it myself." Chapter 11. Affairs of State. Tawnos moved softly through the halls of the palace, with a subtle grace that belied his large frame. In the months since the death of the warlord, everyone had learned to move more quietly. Through the marble halls of the palace of Krug, the news of the warlord's death struck the oceans like a cold wave of seawater. It was sudden, unexpected, and decisive. For most of the oceans, the warlord had been the only leader they had ever known, and he had seemed immortal. Now he was dead, cut down by a phalange blade, said one story. No, said another, his heart was burst by phalange magic. No, contended a third, he was boiled alive by the steaming breath of a diabolic machine, a machine controlled by the chief artificer's evil brother. No, the ruler was wearing one of the chief artificer's amulets, and it exploded. The warlord saved the chief artificer from a red-haired demoness summoned by the chief artificer's evil brother. Even when the truth was finally determined and circulated, the other tales survived and grew in the telling. One tale, both true and widely popular, was that Urza returned from Korlinda late one evening, piloting his distinctive ornithopter and bearing the body of the warlord. It was said he flew without rest from Korlinda. Others noted he did stop briefly, but the flight took him only 2 days. He laid the body to rest in the palace shrine and sent word to the temples of the news. Then he visited the new queen with the sad tidings. The state funeral was lavish and lasted 10 days. People came from the farthest reaches of Yosha to pass before the warlord one last time and pay their final respects. Guards had to be mounted along the funeral bier, not to protect the body but to help move those who collapsed alongside it, fainting from despair. The most notable casualty during this procession was Kayla's matron, who flung herself in tears onto the bier and eventually had to be dispatched to relatives in the country to recover. Queen Kayla and her royal consort, Chief Artificer Urza, appeared only on the last day. Their faces were drawn and tired, and they neither spoke nor smiled during their grim vigil. After the body was interred within its great shrine, the queen retired to her quarters, and the chief artificer went to his ornery. A calm settled over Krug, but it was a false peace. As the merchants returned to the stores, the guildsmen to their crafts, and the scholars to the temple classes, the calm only barely hid the anger of the people. The phalange had killed their beloved warlord, and the desert people would pay. There were incidents. Phalange traders, and in one case a Zegon jeweler, were lynched in the streets. Bands of young adventurers rode into Phalange territory seeking revenge, and when they did not return, additional bands set out to seek revenge for them. In order to prevent further foolhardiness, the army swung its doors wide open to anyone who wished to join. Recruitment tripled in a month. Eventually the queen appeared in public, but she looked worn by her ordeal. Some noted that the warlord had protected her for too long from the duties of her position, and now she was feeling the strain. Others said she was meeting with the nobles and the guild leaders, assembling her own response to the fallagy. Many, including Tawnos, noticed that when she appeared alone. The chief artificer, it was whispered, had retreated to his lab to prepare a secret weapon with which to defeat the desert tribesmen. Some said that it was a new version of ornithopter, more powerful bomb, or a gigantic version of his metal soldier, which had now gained the sobriquet of Urza's Avenger, Fritz. Attempt to seek revenge against the warlord's murderer. When the machine's fragments were returned from Corlinda with the returning army, it was interred alongside the warlord, like a faithful dog with its master. Rusko had not returned, and Tawnos learned that while the clockmaker had survived the attack, he would not be coming back to Krug any time soon. The captain of the guard had been reassigned to a patrol unit to the west along the fallagy frontier and replaced in his duties within the palace. Over the course of the month, every pilot who had gone to Corlinda was transferred as well, also to units along the long frontier with the desert tribesmen. The seneschal remained, but seemed to be on a short leash, with Queen Kayla holding the other end. Every other official, courtier, and servant in the palace was made suddenly aware that if the new queen noticed something she did not care for, that something was removed. Everyone moved around the palace on tiptoe and spoke in whispers. The fallagy were, for the part, surprisingly quiet. They launched a brief raid into the sword marches, which provoked a counter-raid deep into the desert before it ran out of both supplies and enemies. Soon after, the order came down, signed both by the Queen and the Chief Artificer. Every inch of Yotian ground would be held, but no one would raid fallagy territories without explicit orders. Many took this as a sign that the Queen's consort was working on something very deadly and decisive for the fallagy. Of all the people in the city of Krug, only Tawnos knew what the chief artificer had been doing for the month following the warlord's death. Urza had stayed in the ornery night and day. He had dismissed the students for the moment, sending them to mourn the warlord and never calling them back. He allowed Tawnos to remain, though, and his chief apprentice worked hard, keeping the machines oiled and the canvas supple. Mostly, however, Tawnos stayed out of Urza's way. Once or twice a day Urza would emerge from his lair to meet with the newest captain of the guard or to send a terse message to some bureaucrat or other. Then he retreated again to his lair, and in his study he stared at a piece of blank paper mounted on his drawing board. He stared at it for hours. At first Tawnos wondered at what marvels Urza was dreaming up. But after the fifth day, the young toymaker became convinced that his master was simply overwhelmed by the responsibility that awaited him. Outside the ornery, Tawnos had ventured his opinion on the current situation to Urza just once. He had heard others note that the chief artificer would not strike against the fallagy because the desert tribesmen were led by his evil brother, whom Urza had not seen since they were both children. Some argued that Urza hesitated because he wanted to kill his brother himself. Others argued that he was afraid of the brother and did not want to fight. Tawnos cut away the implications of cowardice and put the question to his master. Why had he not struck back? Urza almost exploded. War is a waste of resources, he shouted. We lost 4 ornithopters in that fruitless assault, and I cannot replace them until I get more power stones. Why Should I waste time? Gold and precious lives in battle. To chase ghosts in the desert. Why don't I just burn down the city and save my brother the bother? The outburst was as surprising as it was sudden. Afterward, Tawnos moved more quietly in the ornery as well. Messages arrived, and Tawnos received him at the door. 2. Those sent by the captain of the guard Urza responded in a short note delivered by Tawnos. Sometimes the message was from some merchant or craftsman. Half the time the artificer would respond. Other times he crumpled the letter and tossed it away. Some messages were marked with the signet ring of the queen. These Urza left unopened by his drafting table. A flurry of them appeared for a while, and then they gradually tapered off. Finally such a note arrived for Tawnos, demanding his presence in the Queen's quarters that evening. A meeting at midnight, the missive said, and no one, not even Urza, should be told. Tawnos moved quietly through the corridors. There were no guards in the private wing of the building, and had not been since the warlord's funeral. It was late, and even the servants had abandoned the continual fussing and retired for the evening. He reached the doors to the royal household. In the distance, he heard the temple bells sounding the midnight hour. He knocked softly. For a moment there was nothing, and Tawnos feared his rapping had not been heard. Then a weak voice said, "Enter." Tawnos pushed the door open gently. "Your Majesty." Queen Kayla was seated by the window looking out at the city of Krug spread below. She was dressed in a sheer gown covered by a crimson robe. She held a large brandy snifter in her hand, and even from across the room Tawnos could see it was filled higher than it should have been. The Queen said nothing, and Tawnos entered, closing the door behind him. "Your Majesty," he repeated. Kayla sighed deeply. "No," she said. "Don't call me that. I have been Your Majesty to tears today. Today and every other day." She took a sip of the brandy. "Call me Kayla. Can you do that, Tawnos Toymaker?" Tawnos opened his mouth and tried to form his lips around the words, but they refused to cooperate. Finally, he said, "I'm afraid I can't, Mom." Kayla snorted, a pretty, ladylike sound. "Mom will have to do, then, at least for the moment." She spun in place on the window seat and set her slippered feet to the floor. "Would you like something to eat? I had the kitchen send up some chilled meat and cheeses." She waved an arm at a nearby table. It had been set with fine crystal and silverware and a pair of elegantly twisted candles. Porcelain plates as translucent as the wings of an ornithopter were laden with food. There were meats both chopped and shaved, cheeses, fruits, and several pickled items that Tawnos could not immediately identify. "If you wish, Your Mom," said Tawnos, moving toward the tables. Kayla crossed paths with him, en route to her own seat. As she passed, she stumbled, spilling a bit of her drink and brushing against the apprentice. "Sorry," she murmured, holding a hand out against his chest to steady herself. "Not to worry," replied Tawnos. He inhaled a heady lungful of her perfume mixed with the fumes of brandy. If forced to guess, he would say that the brandy was older than the warlord had been. Tawnos tried to recall the last time the Queen drank more than a single glass of wine with dinner. He came up empty, but surmised that Kayla had already refilled her goblet at least once before he had arrived. Carefully, Tawnos sat down, unsure what to do next. He thought of himself as a simple coastal boy, lacking the sophistication of high ocean society, but he was fairly certain of how the evening was shaping up. Kayla stabbed a morsel of cheese with her knife and waved the cheddar-tipped utensil at the apprentice. "So," she said, "how is he?" "He who, ma'am?" parried Tawnos, looking over the pickled things, trying to determine what exactly they had been in life. His answer amused Kayla. "He who?" he asks. "He who is my loving and dedicated husband, that is who. He who you see more regularly than I these days." She bit off the last words neatly and leaned back, evidently pleased she had managed to say them without tangling her tongue. Tawnos grasped at words. He is well, your majesty." "Kayla," said the queen. Kayla. "Ma'am." Tawnos blushed as he said it. "I write to him, but he does not respond," she sighed, popping the bit of cheese in her mouth and looking for another target. "I know," said Tawnos quietly. "But he has been busy with patrols and things. His designs." "Ah, yes." The queen raised her hands toward the ceiling. "Urza's wonderful designs. How I envy him. He can lock himself up in his room and not talk to anyone, least of all his wife, because he is always working on his wonderful designs." Tawnos suddenly realized he had answered her original question wrong from the start. But how was he to know that she wanted to hear Master Urza was miserable? The queen seemed deeply interested in her brandy glass then. She suddenly looked up. "I didn't expect much from the marriage. You know, I hoped for someone to talk to. Or at least someone to listen. An heir or two to make Daddy happy. And now, no heirs, no Daddy, and not even a husband anymore." She looked over at Tawnos. "So, you?" Tawnos blinked. His head was swimming from the perfume. "Am I? What? Are you someone I can talk to?" asked the queen. "Because I've had it with people whom I can talk at, who make all the right noises but really don't engage in conversation at all." She was motioning with both arms now, the ancient brandy slopping over the sides of the glass. "I can talk at the seneschal, and I can talk at the matron, or I could when she was here. But there's no one I can talk to. I mean, I felt I could talk to Urza," she added softly. "Not often. If there was daylight, he worked on his plans, his wondrous devices. But often enough. And I always liked listening to him, even if I didn't understand what he was talking about. And now, she let her voice trailed off. When Tawnos had been a very young man, he had worked on his uncle's fishing rig. One morning, when he was not paying sufficient attention, the boat had been breached by a large wave, and he had been knocked overboard. The young Tawnos panicked, floundered, and found himself struggling underwater. He was saved by his uncle, who pulled him aboard and suggested gently that the young man find another line of work. At this moment Tawnos felt much the same way, though no helpful uncle was in sight. "I am so jealous of you, you know," Kayla said, her eyes becoming hooded slits as she charged off on a new tack. "I mean, he spends all his time with you, and when he talks about lift and drag and pulley ratios and snail gears, you honestly understand what he's talking about. I'm not dumb, but on my best day I couldn't venture a guess about ideal pulley ratios." Tawnos started to speak. "Everybody has their own strengths and weakness. Am I so horrible she demanded, leaning across the table and grabbing his hand. Am I so repulsive? As she leaned forward, her robe fell open, the gown beneath almost transparent in the candlelight. Tawnos closed his eyes tightly. No, he said, you're not horrible at all. Then why won't he come home? She said, drawing back. Her hand still clutched him, and her voice was filled with unwept tears. He sleeps at his work. You know that. That's what I need to know. Why won't he come back to me? Carefully, Tawnos pried the queen's fingers from around his wrists. As he spoke, he was aware that Kayla was listening for the first time that evening. I think, he said calmly, he's in pain himself. Him, said Kayla, leaning back. The great thinking machine. The paragon of logic. The chief artifact of Krug. All that, replied Tawnos. And the man who stood next to your father when he was killed. The man who could not save him from dying. Have you talked to him about what happened at Corlinda? I mean, really talked. Kayla looked at him and blinked. I'll take that as a no, then, said Tawnos. But he didn't know what Daddy was planning, she said. I didn't realize it myself. Right, answered Tawnos. But that doesn't make it any easier. Urza came back, and everyone treated him like a hero. Because he survived, and your father didn't. And he has to come back to you. He motioned with his hands. So he doesn't come back, finished Kayla softly. The fuzziness of the alcohol seemed banished for the moment. He's punishing himself because he thinks I blame him. Or why should blame him, even if I don't? Which I don't. Grunted Tawnos. So I should march down to his workshop and we should talk about this? She asked. Tawnos held up both hands, remembering his own experience at being direct. Perhaps it would be better to start with something else. Something not directly connected with the past few months. Do you two have any happy moments together? Wait, said Kayla, and Tawnos thought of an overworked engine, leaking steam and straining to function. Yes. Yes, I do. Start with that, said Tawnos. The queen's face brightened visibly. Yes. Yes, I know what will work. She crossed over to the writing desk and penned a short note, then handed it to Tawnos. Here. Give this to Urza. Make sure he reads it. Tell him it is urgent. Of course, said Tawnos, rising from his chair. He'll still be awake at this hour. And Tawnos, she said. The apprentice turned, and Kayla leaned forward, pressing her lips against his cheeks. Thank you. Tawnos blushed, the blood in his face clear even in the candlelight. It is my pleasure. The kingdom can't take much more of everyone walking on eggshells around you two. Not that, she said. That was for being a better person than I might be. Tawnos made sure Urza read the message, and 15 minutes later, the chief artificer poked his head into his own living quarters. My queen, he said. Kayla. Queen Kayla Bing Krug was seated at a table set with fine crystal and laden with meats and cheeses. My chief artificer. Thank you for coming on such short notice. Your note said there was an emergency, said Urza, his eyes adjusting to the candlelight. A technical emergency. Yes, responded the queen. I have a small music box. An heirloom. I think it's broken. She motioned to the place setting opposite her. On the plate was a small silver box. Carefully Urza opened the box, then turned it over slowly in his hands. "I think that all is wrong with it is that the spring has wound down again," he said at last. Kayla opened her eyes wide. "Wound down?" Urza nodded and cleared his throat. "Yes. I would need a key for it." "A key," she said, and opened her robe. The sheer gown she wore was almost translucent in the candlelight. Around her neck, she wore a pink ribbon, and hanging from that ribbon was a battered metal key, red with rust along one edge. "Would this one do, Lord Artificer?" Urza looked at the key and at the music box. He stared long and deep into the Queen's eyes. "Yes," he said at last. "I think that will do indeed." And for the first time in a month, Urza smiled. The chief artificer did not come to the ornery the next day, nor the day after that. On the third day, Tawnos arrived to find a sheaf of parchment marked with detailed instructions, starting with recalling the students and quickly moving on to a list of improvements to ornithopter design and plans for building new Avenger-style mechanical men. There was no sign of Urza, and a marginal note to Tawnos indicated that he should not be expected until mid-afternoon. If then. Tawnos allowed himself a healthy grin and quickly began to fulfill Master Urza's list of demands. Chapter 12. Phyrexia. The winter dust storm boiled out of the south, a major sirocco that reached from horizon to horizon and climbed almost to the zenith of the sky. It was a grandfather storm, one that the old people spoke of, a storm that blotted the sun with its shadow. The storm breathed dust-laden winds capable of flaying the living flesh from those caught in the open. Along its leading edge, great tornadoes spawned and danced, only to be sucked back within the advancing wall of churning black dust. The storm overtook the lumbering form of the Macfarware and swallowed it whole, disturbing neither the storm nor the dragon engine. The Macfarware continued to roll forward, unfazed by the swirling winds and pounding sand that assailed it. Though one could no longer see across the width of the creature's body, the engine plodded forward with the resolute and absolute confidence of a machine. Mishra and Ashnod huddled in a cramped space beneath the creature's back plates. The dragon engine had not been designed to carry passengers within, but there was a low-roofed hollow along the beast's spine, and the Raki and his apprentice crouched there, listening to the sand rasp against the metal flesh around them. "How can it see where it's going?" shouted Ashnod over the clatter of blowing sand. "It does not need to see," replied Mishra. "It knows as surely as I know what direction it needs to go. It seeks out the secret heart of the Thran. I can feel Koilos's call, and because the machine responds to me, so can it feel the pull, like a raptor returning to the same nest with each passing season." Ashnod stared at the stocky man huddled next to her. Mishra's tendency to cloak his words in illusions and mysticism bothered her. Did he truly believe what he said, or was it all just verbal play to cover the fact that he did not know? Ashnod wanted to believe the former, because otherwise they were charging blindly through a grandfather storm, navigated only by a vague feeling in Mishra's heart. It was in the winter of the year of the Korlinda massacre, the year that the warlord of Krug perished at the hands of the young Kadir, that Mishra and Ashnod set out for Koilos, the secret heart of the Thran. They told no one among the Suwardiv their plans or of the destination, not even Hardrant, particularly not the Kadir. The idea that the tribe's Raki was seeking out the secret heart of the Thran once more would not have been a comforting thought to the leader of the falange. The retreat from Corlinda had been harrowing, and only one of every 5 men who entered Corlus returned to falange lands. The survivors had traveled by night, cowering in mountain passes, constantly seeking places to hide the huge Macfarwa from the pursuing ornithopters. The Qadir had at first wanted to turn around and launch an immediate counter-attack. Cooler heads, and the fact that they were a mere fraction of their initial numbers, convinced him to withdraw and take comfort in the apparent death of the warlord. Ultimately, the Qadir blamed his Raki for the ambush. Mishra should have known that his talented and treacherous brother was among the enemy. Mishra should have told the Qadir immediately. Upon discovering that fact, Mishra should have concentrated on protecting him, the Qadir, instead of giving commands to his dragon engine during the attack. And of course, Ashnod thought ironically Mishra was at fault for coming out of this debacle more popular among the falange than ever. The other tribal chieftains made sure that the Raki was all right and asked about the health of the Qadir as a secondary matter. While the Qadir had slain the ancient warlord, it was Mishra and his engine who were credited with saving those who made it back to the falange lands. No one blamed Mishra for the ambush save the Qadir, but the chieftain made his complaints well known to anyone who was nearby, and no one would disagree with the corpulent young man. The Qadir had other complaints upon their return. Mishra should have found more machines by now similar to his Macfarwa. A single dragon engine was too big a target and too vulnerable. He reminded Mishra of the difficulties they had experienced at Zegon. If the Yotians could field dozens of their machines, the Qadir should be able to do the same. Of course, no one doubted Mishra's loyalty, the Qadir said, or his talent, though in mentioning him the young chieftain managed to bring both into doubt. It had been many years since the Raki had first conjured the Macfarwa, and now his people needed more. There were whispers, which the Qadir assured Mishra were completely disbelieved by anyone who truly accounted, that the Raki was afraid of his brother's flying machines and his brother's power. Ashnod had watched the entire dressing down, silent as a woman among the falange was expected to be. After the Qadir had dismissed him, she snarled quietly to Mishra, "But what have you done for me lately?" Mishra merely returned to his own tent and began to issue orders. They needed to locate more finds of Old One artifacts, preferably ones that were nearly operational. Scouts were sent out with orders describing what to look for. Within the month, they had returned with news of the large device located near the banks of the Marden River. The Qadir, busy reconfirming his power over the other tribes, allowed his Raki and the raids woman to investigate. The site was large, and the remains were generally complete. The machine was evidently some sort of transport used by the Thran to haul unknown equipment. It appeared to be a great wagon or wain, and had been overturned in whatever accident that had claimed it. Rust blossomed along both sides of its skeleton, and its spoked wheels were twisted and shattered. The wire-laden framework that held the power crystals was missing, if it had existed at all. Mishra shook his head. It would require time and effort to put this monstrosity back together, and even then it would be but a fraction of the grandeur of the Macfarwa. The Qadir would not be pleased. The morning after surveying the find, Mishra left Harjin charge of the excavation and departed, taking both the dragon engine and Ashnod with him. They headed east and traveled night and day, the dragon engine a tireless mount. They slept within the creature's metal carapace and now hid there while the great storm blossomed out of the southern horizon. They were trapped within the beast's body for 10 days and nights while the storm whirled around them. They had sufficient supplies and light, but the protected hollow was barely comfortable for one and tight for two. To pass the time, Mishra told Ashnod the story of his first visit to Tawnos. He also took the opportunity to inform her how she might better conduct herself among the falange. Soon Ashnod was willing to consider braving the storms outside to avoid listening further to Mishra point out her foibles, great and small. "I did nothing wrong," she finally said in frustration on the 10th day of the storm, after Mishra mentioned, for the 5th time that day, a recent incident in the Qadir's camp. "The warrior you struck down would disagree," replied Mishra. "He said I thought like a man," she said, exasperated. "It is an old desert saying," replied Mishra. "It is meant to be a compliment." "Trust me," said Ashnod, "it isn't." "You did not need to cripple him," said Mishra sternly. Ashnod forcefully placed a hand against Mishra's broad chest. "Would you prefer if I said I turned my staff on him because he insulted my gentle, feminine ears with lewd and guttural suggestions?" she asked. "Because he did that too." Mishra did not respond immediately. Instead he pointed to the outer hull and said, "Listen." Ashnod paused. "I don't hear anything." "Exactly," said Mishra. "I think we have passed through the storm at last. Check outside." Ashnod blinked at the man. "And if this is only a momentary lull in the winds, what happens if they kick up again while I'm outside?" Mishra leaned against the inner wall. "You're the apprentice. That means if a task is dangerous or unpleasant, it's your job." Muttering, Ashnod inched toward the access plates and carefully peeled them back and peered outside. There was a wall of blackness along the north, but the sky above was bright blue, and the sands had already settled in the wake of the great storm. "It's over," said Mishra, following her out from their hiding place within the mechanical beast. "We can ride on the outside for a while." "And not a moment too soon," muttered Ashnod, not caring if Mishra heard her or not. In the wake of the storm, they saw no other living thing. The desert had been wiped clean, and old rock formations had been buried as new ones were exposed. At last, after another week of travel, they reached the canyon of Tawnos. The site was untouched by the storm and apparently undisturbed since Mishra was last there. The bleached bones of the rock were still scattered in front of the cave entrance, mixed with the wreckage of other ancient Thran machines. As they moved through the valley, Mishra grew quiet and somber. Ashnod thought the man was reliving old memories, some apparently painful. They poured through the wreckage and the ruins immediately around the cavern's mouth, but after several days' work the two had come up with nothing that could be immediately pressed into the Qadir's service. "Those metal spiders might have been useful once," said Ashnod that evening. "But your brother definitely did a number on them when that machine exploded. They weren't in the best condition before, and now they're little more than scrap." In the firelight, Mishra flinched just a bit at the mention of his brother. Ashnod had discovered that the subject of Urza was off-limits around the younger brother, a fact that made her all the more curious about their relationship. Mishra did not respond to her comment, and Ashnod saw him staring at the rock bones at the base of the plateau and the cavern they partially concealed. Whatever answer was at Tawnos lay within the caverns. That night Mishra slept badly and awoke screaming. Ashnod calmed him as best as she was able. "I dreamed of the wind, of a great dark wind," was all he said, the night sweat evaporating in the still air. "It swept around me, it spoke to me, and it carried horrible secrets it wanted to tell me." "It will be all right," murmured Ashnod. "It's just a dream. Dreams aren't important." "They're to me," said Mishra, staring into the darkness. In the morning they entered the caverns. The long corridor had been brightly lit once, Mishra had said, but it was now dark again, and they brought oil lamps with them. Ashnod ran a hand over the inner walls of the tunnel. There were bricks there, but she could not see the joints. They passed the wreckage of the Suchi Guardians. Mishra picked up one black and narrow-headed skull and smashed it against the wall. It cracked like a walnut, but instead of meat, inside there was a power stone, an eye of the old ones. It was slightly chipped, but still held the fire of the Thran energies. He granted approval, and they continued. They reached an interminable set of stairs and came at last to the great cavern, the lair of the Thran machines. It was bathed in a flickering light of inconstant crystalline plates along the ceiling. The centermost machine was made up of a great series of plates and mirrors surrounding an empty spot. Mishra placed the stone from the Suchi's head in the void of the machine. Immediately there came a low humming, a throbbing, that seemed to issue from the walls itself. The flickering stopped, and the entire cavern was bathed in a soft light. "How did you know to do that?" asked Ashnod. "I just knew," replied Mishra. He sounded as if he were 1,000 miles away. Then the Raki shrugged, apparently shaking off an old memory. Ashnod examined the bank of glyphs and lights before the great machine, set into a podium that looked like a huge open-faced book. She did not touch the glyphs but studied each in turn. Somewhere among the signs was a mechanism that opened other doors that had held the mechanical humanoids whose remains littered the entrance. If they could find them, she and Mishra reasoned, they could bring back new wonders for the Qadir. Working wonders. After a short while, Mishra asked, "Well?" Ashnod shook her head. The glyphs were simple geometric shapes and could be labels, instructions, or dire warnings. They provided no clue as to the purpose of the machines. She pointed. "This one might be the symbol of a doorway." Mishra looked over her shoulder and assented. "Press it," he said. "Is this something else you just know?" asked Ashnod. Mishra frowned. "I'm guessing as much as you. But press it anyway. It feels like the right thing to do." Ashnod brushed the glyph with her long fingertips, and somewhere in the depths of the mountain there was a low chime. More felt than heard. Something deep within the Thran machine had engaged, and Ashnod hoped that it was connected with other working mechanisms. She held her breath. A light appeared in the air to their right. First a mote. Hanging in space, it soon expanded, twisting the air around it, until it formed a thin, glowing disk, positioned perpendicular to the ground, hanging unsupported. Slowly Ashnod walked around it. It seemed as thin as the Qadir's temper and had a soft, almost enticing radiance to it. Along the surface of the disk Ashnod could almost see a set of scribed hairlines, forming the shape of a child's star. Ashnod looked at Mishra, but he did nothing. The disc grew until it was twice the size of a man. Ashnod leaned her black thunderwood staff forward and pressed its butt end against the disc. The light offered no resistance, nor did it dissipate at the touch. She leaned forward, and the staff passed easily through the disc. But the staff did not come out the other side. Ashnod had shoved 3 feet of wood into a wafer-thin glowing disc, and nothing came out the other side. Ashnod withdrew the staff. The immersed end seemed unharmed. Ashnod looked at Mishra again. "We've found our doorway," said Mishra calmly. "Who goes in first?" asked Ashnod. Mishra looked at her. After a moment, she nodded. "Right," she said. "If it's dangerous or unpleasant, it's the apprentice's job." Ashnod stepped through the glowing disc. The light surrounded her and saturated her. For a moment she thought she heard, faintly, the voice of an old woman shouting. But then that passed as well, and she was in another world. The first thing that she was aware of was the heat, not the desert heat, dry and comforting, but a wet, damp heat she had not felt since the swamps of Almaz. It settled on her like a blanket. Now she felt the smell, a pungent scent of rotten decay. No, there was more to it than that, she thought. It smelled of oil. And chemicals, too. It smelled of goblin powder, of fire, and of steel. For a moment she thought she was back at Corlinda, fleeing. As the bombs dropped around them, there were colors. A riot of jungle plants surrounded her, all in bloom, bright splotches against a sea of dark green leaves and vines. But the colors were wrong. They were too hard, too bright, too alien, and they had a metallic sheen to them. And the vines, they were uniform, more like cables than any natural thing. She touched one of the flowers and pulled her hand away quickly. Whatever juice the bloom was leaking was slightly caustic and stung her skin. A dragonfly settled on the flower, but on closer inspection, Ashnod saw it was not truly an insect, but rather a tiny machine, made of silver wire and gold plates. She reached out to grab it, but the dragonfly was gone in a wink, darting deeper into the jungle. She turned around. Mishra was stepping through the radiant disk, emerging like a swimmer from the sea. "Yes," he said, "it is just as I remembered it." "You've been here before?" asked Ashnod. "Only in dreams," replied Mishra. Indeed, there was a distracted, dreamlike quality in the way he spoke. Ashnod gripped her staff more tightly and looked at the sky. It was overcast and glowed with a reddish hue, like hot coals under a blanket of snow. "Phyrexia," Mishra said at last. Ashnod looked at him and said, "The dreams again." Mishra nodded absent-mindedly. "Words carried on the black winds," he said. "This place is called Phyrexia." He stared into the middle distance, trying to get his bearings. "That way," he said at last. "I think the ground slopes down to a pond or something. Actually, it sloped down to a lake, a large black mirror, covered with rainbow patterns of oil. Several large machines, akin to the Magfar, were back in coilos, waded through its oily expanse, dredging other pieces of metal from the lake's shallow floor. There were 4 of them, Ashnod saw. "You stay here," said Mishra. "Keep your staff ready." "What are you doing?" asked Ashnod. Mishra blinked at her. "I'm going to try to control them, as I controlled our dragon engine." He spoke as if the answer to her question was obvious. "And if they don't want to be controlled?" asked Ashnod. That's why you have to keep your staff ready, returned Mishra. Be prepared to run. Ashnod waited nervously as Mishra crept forward. One of the dragon engines, the smallest, saw him first, and let out a low, bleating cry. The other three looked up at once. All four converged on Mishra, the smallest reaching him first. Ashnod held her breath as the small metallic dragon leaned forward toward the newcomer, sniffing him as a dog would. Stranger. Mishra stood calmly, as if being sniffed by engines of mass destruction was a common occurrence. Then the dragon engine dropped on its haunches and laid its head against the ground. The other three did the same. Ashnod could see these were not identical to the Makfar where she knew. Their heads were blunter, shaped more like shovels, and their hides were duller than the brass monster they had left behind. Mishra waved for Ashnod to come ahead, and she stepped into the clearing by the lake, her staff still at the ready. Mishra nodded grimly. It's not the stone, he said. I thought it was my power stone that controlled them, but it's not. It's me. I can think what I want them to do, and they will do it. He seemed more puzzled than pleased by the discovery. Good, said Ashnod, wondering for a moment exactly how good it was. But these seem large to take back through the portal. Can you master something smaller? There was a gong in the distance, the deep chiming of an iron bell. The dragon engines looked up and almost bolted back into the oily lake. The bell tolled again, this time close, and the dragon engines started to waver, caught between their obedience to Mishra and the fear of whatever was approaching. The bell tolled a third time, and Ashnod could now hear twisting, rending noise of metallic vegetation being ripped from its roots. The three larger engines panicked and splashed back into the lake. The smaller one remained but whined like an engine caught between gears. Part of the forest to their left disappeared, and a true giant lumbered forward. It was shaped like a land-going ship set on treads, with a great maw set into its brow. Within the maw were spinning sets of teeth, like great scythes. They ripped through the plants and trees of the jungle with ease. When it struck a particularly large tree, the shattered bits of trunk made the booming, bell-like noise. And standing above the mouth on a platform was a tall, demonic figure. It seemed to be made of metal as well, and shards of dark bone erupted from its leathery skin. It wore armor that seemed almost a part of it. A rictus grin of exposed skin gleamed along its fleshless face. A pair of horns nested among a tangle of swaying, worm-like tendrils that sprang from its head and swept backward like banners made of human skin. Run! Shouted Mishra, but Ashnod needed no encouragement. She followed the Raki back up the hill toward the glowing disk that led to safety. The vegetation tore at her robes as she ran, as if it were trying to ensnare her, to hold her in thrall for the dark machine that pursued them. Something tore a long gash along one arm, and a flower fluttered in her face, nearly blinding her with its acid. She looked back only once, to see that the smallest of the dragon engines had not fled back to the lake but was standing, bleating plaintively. The demon machine with its spinning scythes was almost on top of it. The machine did not slow down as it rammed the smaller creature. The dragon engine disappeared in a flurry of silver, wire and metal plates. Ashnod turned around and ran faster. Behind them, the machine had turned and was pursuing them up the hill. Mishra was waiting at the portal but would not go through without her. She dived into the portal headfirst. Part of her mind noted that they had not truly established that the disk led back to the caverns, but she thought really anywhere they landed would have less error than the Phyrexian beast that followed them. She sprawled across the cold stone floor of the chamber, her staff skittering ahead of her and slamming against the far wall. She turned in place and saw Mishra nimbly dash through the disk as well. He turned to the book-shaped embankment, and his hands hesitated over the collection of glyphs. He touched one, and nothing happened. Ashnod shouted, and Mishra reached out to grab the power crystal from its cradle among the mirrors. He pulled it from its socket and cursed as the warm crystal burned his flesh. The stone that could power the suchi was insufficient to maintain the great Thran machine and was overloaded with power. Mishra dropped the smoking stone, and it smashed against the floor into 100 shards. The golden disc winked out of sight. Ashnod held a hand to her chest and felt her heart thundering against her ribcage. For the first time she considered the idea that the Makfawa might have other masters in addition to Mishra, and that those masters might object to trespasses. To Mishra she said, "The creature on the machine. You knew what it was?" Mishra nodded, gasping for breath. Ashnod said, "From your dreams." Mishra nodded again. "Remind me to pay more attention to dreams," Ashnod muttered quietly, half to herself. Mishra shook his head and blew on his burned fingers. "We got what we came for. Come along now." Without the Suchi's power stone in its cradle, the lights began to flicker again. Mishra headed for the mouth of the cavern at a rapid clip. Confused, Ashnod followed. She caught up with him at the entranceway. "What do you mean?" she said. "We got what we came for. We had to leave everything behind and slammed the door behind us to avoid that machine demon." Mishra held up a hand. "Shush. Watch." There was a tremor that ran up the length of the canyon, and Ashnod saw one of the surviving buildings along the valley floor cave in on itself. Then, near the cavern entrance, the ground erupted. A shovel-headed dragon's head launched from the sand, like an arrow, trailing its serpentine neck behind it. There was another eruption and another dragon's head, and then a third. The 3 engines from the lake, transported from there to here. All 3 clawed their way from the sand and half slithered, half rolled toward the cavern entrance. They knelt before Mishra, recognizing him as the new master. "Impressive," said Ashnod. "So what do we do now?" Mishra smiled. It was an unpleasant grimace, but it was the first smile Ashnod had seen from him since they entered the canyon. "Now," he said thoughtfully, as if turning over possibilities in his mind. He looked at the dragon engines and said, "Now we call another peace conference." Back in the cavern, there was a flicker of light, and the golden portal opened again. This time it could only manage to create a disk a few inches in circumference. A leathery hand, its flesh dotted with shards of dark metal bone, reached through the small portal and clawed at the air. Once, twice, a third time, it scrabbled about, looking for something solid to grab hold of. Then the lights of the portal wavered again, and the hand pulled quickly back, withdrawing seconds before the portal closed entirely. And everything was quiet in the caverns of Koilos for another few years. Chapter 13. Peace Talks. The offer of peace talks came after a year of semi-regular fighting along the northern desert borders of the Sword Marches. It caught Tawnos and the rest of Yosha by surprise. The offer came without warning or preamble. A falange rider appeared at one of the Yoshan outposts under a flag of truce, bearing a message for the Queen of Krug from the Qadir of the swoop. The message was relayed to one of the ornithopter bases, deep within Yoshan territory, and from there borne by air to the Privy Council at Krug. The council consisted of the Queen, the Seneschal, the Captain of the Guard, and Tawnos. For a brief period a year earlier, Urza had attended the meetings faithfully, but soon he began sending his apprentice as his proxy. With the arrival of the Qadir's message, though, Urza appeared in the council at the Queen's right hand. Tawnos stood behind the chief artificer's chair and to one side. The apprentice noticed that Urza's eyes did not leave the ornately scribed scroll now spread before them. An offer for peace, said Kayla. An offer of truce, corrected the Seneschal with a slight quaver in his voice. A cessation of hostilities, a pulling back of forces, while peace is being discussed. How bad are the hostilities? Kayla turned to the captain of the guard. The newest captain, as he was still thought of by many, was a thoughtful man and paused before he responded. Sporadic but serious enough, he said, and paused again. The mannerism bothered Tawnos, but the others at the table had grown used to the captain's habit and let him gather his thoughts. They fall into two groups, he said finally. One seems to be a traditional raid of the falange type, a rapid push into our territory, looting a random town or caravan they encounter, then retreating before our forces can arrive. The other type of assault is carried out by a larger, more organized force that seems intent on destroying a specific target, such as a bridge, a mill, or a fort. The dragon engine often accompanies these raids. There is less looting but more destruction. Those are organized attacks, said Urza softly. The others are just parties of desert raiders, seeking their own loot and glory. The attacks with the dragon engine are more organized and have a firm objective in mind. His eyes did not leave the parchment bearing the truce offer. Those organized raids have my brother's approval and share his planning. Approved or not, ventured the Seneschal, the effect is to demoralize the people of the sword marchers and all along the River Marden. The falange regularly raid the territories on the far side of the river, and rumors swirl that they plan an attack across it sometime in the near future. Are they indeed planning such an attack? Asked Kayla, her voice firm and her manner dispassionate. Tawnos noticed that in council she usually let all sides speak, then made her decision. The Seneschal looked at the captain, who paused, then said, "We have no knowledge at this time. We have fortified encampments on the far sides of the river, with bonfire towers to warn of us of any massed movements. The river is wide enough that even if they found or built sufficient boats, we would be prepared for any assault long before they could launch it." Another pause. "However, maintaining garrisons along the Marden stretch as our resources even further." Kayla thought about what the newest captain said, then nodded. "We can use the ornithopters for additional patrols. Those resources are stretching thin as well," said Urza. "We have nearly 30 machines in 6 patrols of 5 each. If we get the power stones from Argai for which we have asked, then we can double that number, but the Argivian crown is being the lean." Man bit his lip, reticent. Kayla nodded again. From what Urza had told her, the Argivians were practically swimming in power stones, most of them from Takasia's original encampment. However, it appeared that prying the stones from the ground was simple compared to prying them from the Argivian's hands. Instead, she said, "What is the status of the flights?" Urza answered while the captain was pausing. 5 of the flights are in the field, at bases throughout the northern sword marches. The 6th is here at the capital. The sword marches flights operate from permanent bases. I was thinking that we could establish a series of such bases along the border and move the flights from one to another as need be. The captain frowned and said, "That would be taxing on the pilots. We have more capable pilots than we have craft for them to fly," Urza replied. "The additional camps would give us sufficient maneuverability and increase our ability to respond. And perhaps they would give us the same element of surprise that the falange are currently enjoying." The captain shook his head. "The pilots need their rest." "Should the machines sleep just because the men do?" asked Urza. There was a brittle irony in his voice. Tawnos had seen this battle before. When it came to the ornithopters, the master artificer held more sway than the captain of the guard did. The captain paused for a moment, then shrugged his shoulders in defeat. Kayla watched the interplay coolly, then said, "Urza, provide any plans for multiple bases to the captain. In the meantime, it sounds as if we are stretched thin indeed." "We have more than just ornithopters," said the captain. "We have foot patrols, civilian riders, and cavalry patrols." He paused for a moment and looked at Urza. "But yes, the continual raiding has stretched us thin." "Then we will accept the offer to talk," said Kayla. "Perhaps together we can come up with a solution." "Unlikely," said Urza. "Their demands, made back at Kolinda, we direct and left little room for negotiation. They want all the land they consider traditional falange territories. That includes the sword marches. Are you prepared to give that to them?" Kayla shook her head firmly. "It is part of my father's legacy, for good or ill. Still, we will talk, if nothing else, to show the Yosha they deal with now is not the one they dealt with at Kolinda." She rose from her seat, indicating the council was ended. The captain and seneschal rose as well. Urza, however, remained seated. The chief artificer reached out and tapped the parchment. "The question is," he said to Tawnos, "are they the same falange we dealt with at Kolinda?" The offer was accepted, and word was relayed back to the borders by Ornithopter. Negotiators set a date at the end of the next month at Krug itself. A route of safe passage was proposed by the falange through the heart of the sword marches. The captain of the guard protested, and the seneschal counter-offered a route along the Marden River, just skirting the edges of the contested borderlands. The seneschal expected the falange to reject any deviation from the demands, but was pleasantly surprised when they accepted the alternate route without change. In the capital city of Krug, preparations were subdued. Anti-falange graffiti was carefully washed from the alleyway. Bricks and a great open area was cleared before the city's thick walls for the expected troops. Again, the seneschal was pleased to discover that the falange would be bringing little more than an honor guard. He was less pleased to hear they would also bring the dragon engine. Urza and the newest captain took their own precautions. The palace troops were drilled to within an inch of perfection, and the normal garrison was supplemented by troops from the coastal regiments. They recalled a second flight of ornithopters from the sword marches to Krug to join the 5 craft already there. Urza wanted ornithopters aloft directly over the fallagy processioners. It moved south, but the fallagy bridled at this, making their displeasure known through the seneschal. For several days, Tawnos was sure that negotiations would break down over this point, but Urza at last relented. There would, however, be a regular cavalry escort while the fallagy were in Yotian territory. Urza also took pains to review all the pilots of the ornithopters at the capital, in some cases interviewing the young men himself. Tawnos accompanied the chief artificer on several of these interviews, though he was puzzled by Urza's action motive. The pilots were hand-picked and trained by Urza in the first place, and were intensely loyal to the prince consort. As Urza talked to them, though, Tawnos saw what the artificer was worried about. Loyalty was not an issue, it was assumed, and indeed, Urza was considered halfway between a legend and a saint by his pilots. His questions focused on how the pilots felt about the fallagy, about the desert, about the long-running battles they had been fighting. He was, Tawnos realized, looking into the temperaments, trying to discern if any would accidentally or purposefully attempt to finish the job the warlord had started. He was examining them as if they were just another component in a larger device, checking them for signs of wear and tear. Indeed, there were 2 individuals who confessed a hatred of the fallagy, and one who promised his loyalty even when he disagreed with diplomacy. Urza relocated these young men to other flights and replaced him with more even-tempered individuals. In considering Urza's actions, Tawnos realized the chief artificer had been caught by surprise once before and did not want to repeat the mistake a second time. With a precision that the apprentice had previously seen the chief artificer dedicate to his inventions, Urza investigated every unit stationed at the capital. He knew every merchant who had claimed injury from the fallagy, and Tawnos knew Urza had walked every inch of the walls that flanked 3 sides of Krug, and along every inch of the shore of the Marden, which served as the 4th protective barrier for the city. Still, the older man had little hope for the negotiations, and said as much to Tawnos. The Qadir wanted nothing less than the land that Kayla's late father had conquered, he reiterated, and she would not give it up. Then why negotiate at all? Tawnos asked. Urza sighed deeply and said, sometimes even foes should get together to talk. Nothing may come of this talk, but if the sides can discuss without incident, that gives hope for the next meeting. Tawnos thought there was more than that. The meeting for which the chief artificer was planning so carefully was not fallagy and Yotian, he realized, nor Queen and Qadir. The meeting was between himself and his younger brother. The messages started arriving soon after the fallagy reached the borders of the sword marchers, arriving at regular intervals, as Urza had ordered. The fallagy contingent was smaller than that which they had presented at Korlinda, as the Qadir had promised. The dragon engine was present, but it was being used to pull a great metal wain, almost as big as itself, with huge gear-like wheels. While hitched to the wain, the engine moved slowly, keeping pace with the rest of the troops. The Yotian Council argued about the presence of the wain. The seneschal suggested it might be a gift. The newest captain thought it might contain additional troops. Urza told Tawnos it was a display of power, a reminder that Mishra had not been merely resting since Kalinda. In the end, Kayla chose not to make an issue of the unexpected addition to the fansThe party. Urza ordered one of the flights grounded at the border to return to normal operations, and a second to parallel the fansThe party, remaining to the east and out of sight. On the fifth day of the fansThe journey southward, 5 days before the arrival of the party in Krug, there were new rumors of amassing of fansThe troops on the far northern border of the sword marches. The seneschal thought that, if true, it might be one of the more traditional raids, perhaps by individuals who wanted to see the negotiations crumble. The captain argued that, regardless of purpose, any fansThe incursions would be disastrous at this time, and the ornithopters were needed to scout in the desert. Urza at first refused, only to be overruled by Kayla. Reluctantly, the chief artificer allowed 3 flights, including the one shadowing the dragon engine, to be reassigned to the far north. Urza did not explain to Tawnos the factors that convinced him to change his mind, but several of the household staff heard a serious row in the royal quarters. Tawnos knew that Urza spent the next few nights working late at the ornery. The chief artificer claimed to be working on improvements to the Avenger-style automatons, but thereafter he attended the council only when specifically summoned by his wife. On the 10th day the fansThe arrived before the walls of Krug. The battlements had been hung with colorful banners, as if festive bunting would conceal the strength and purpose of the stonework beneath. The walls were bedecked with most of the populace of Krug, as well as were the windows of every building that commanded a view of the visitors. The merchants had made a killing-selling telescopes, an Argivian fancy consisting of 2 polished lenses set along the length of a metal tube. Indeed, Krug seemed a city of observers as the fansThe party neared. Her Majesty, the Prince Consort, Tawnos the Seneschal, and the newest captain waited with other bureaucrats at the north gatehouse for the fansThe to present themselves. There were fewer fansThe than there had been at Kalinda, and the sunlight sparkled off the polished brass of their wide helmets and heavy shoulder ornaments. But few counted the number of men, for the dragon engine captured everyone's attention. Tawnos, standing with the others at the gatehouse, was amazed by the beast. It was as if a living thing had been transformed into a machine. It was a dragon whose muscles had been replaced with cables, its hide with plates of metal, its eyes with great gems. It moved like a living thing as well, with little flinches and muscle ticks, swinging its head slowly from one side to another, apparently curious about its surroundings. Urza had told Tawnos of the engine and had said that Mishra found it beneath the desert. But this was no Thran creation, Tawnos thought, and it was as far removed from the chief artificer's Avengers as a living bird differed from the ornithopters. Tawnos was impressed, and that was with a prior warning from Urza. He could only imagine what the rest of the populace were thinking. The dragon engine was in harness, like a caravan oxed, and pulled the huge wagon almost as large as itself. The wain, though, held no sense of wonder as did the mechanical beast harnessed to it. The wagon looked like a metallic 4-story inn that had been suddenly given wheels and turned loose on the world. Its sharp angles and exposed rivets marked it as originally being of Thran design. Numerous portals and Battlements bristled along its flanks, set with catapults and small ballista. The weapons were unloaded for the moment and wrapped beneath tarps that no more concealed the purpose than the banners did the walls of Krug. Kayla had ordered the ornithopters displayed outside the walls, one flight to either side of the north gate. They were on the ground, their crews standing ready next to them. They were intended both as reassurance and as warning, much as a sheathed sword laid upon a table might remind one's opponent that while there was no intention of treachery, the negotiators were prepared to fight. The pilots in blue and white tabards waited patiently by the machines. The falange formed a line opposite them, a respectful distance away. The dragon engine and its burden drew up before the gates and came at last to rest. As it did so, Tawnos noted something Urza had not mentioned. A dull throbbing came from the beast as fluids gurgled through hidden tubes and hydraulic joints shifted in place. The humming was akin to a heartbeat, and Tawnos could feel it more than he could hear it. The machines came to rest, and after a short interval, a door opened in the side of the great wain. A staircase was lowered, and down the stairs came two figures. Neither was the Qadir. Instead, Mishra led the way, followed by his assistant. Tawnos had not met either, yet from the way Mishra carried himself, Tawnos knew he must be Urza's brother. The younger brother was shorter, heavier, and dark-haired, with a tightly trimmed beard. But there was something in his walk, and in the face beneath that beard, that marked him as kin to the chief artificer of Krug, prince consort of Yosha. Mishra was bedecked in the flowing robes of a desert prince, his head bare, and his face beaming with a great smile. He blinked in the afternoon sun and waved to the crowds on the battlement. There were catcalls among the responding cheers, but the younger brother seemed not to notice. Yet much as the wain was diminished by the dragon engine that served it, so was Mishra dimmed by his companion. She was a slender woman with hair the color of blood-stained rubies, dressed in dark clothes, a flowing cape billowing behind her. She carried a simple, unadorned staff of black wood and seemingly did not recognize the crowd's shouts, for she kept her gaze forward. From Urza's description, Tawnos knew this must be Ashnod. No Qadir emerged from the metallic wain, and in the gatehouse the ocean leaders held a quick conference. If the Qadir was not present, noted the seneschal, then the queen should not appear either for the initial welcoming. A group similar in protocol should respond to the falange's initial delegation. More might be taken as a sign of weakness, less as an insult. That meant Urza and Tawnos would greet the new arrivals. The chief artificer nodded, his face stiffening slightly as he saw his brother on the field. Tawnos thought the artificer would rather speak with his brother privately, but this was not to be. The queen would remain at the gatehouse as the artificer and his apprentice met the falange representatives. Urza was stiff and formal as they crossed the open space between the city and the falange. Tawnos kept an appropriate 2 paces behind and to the right, marshalling his own features to a calm demeanor. Urza stopped before Mishra and Ashnod and, without preamble, raised his empty hands slightly, as if he were a priest giving benediction. "Welcome to Krug, brother," he said. Mishra flung both arms outward, and for a moment, Tawnos thought the younger brother was going to rush his elder and hug him. Instead, Mishra bowed deeply. Tawnos noted that Ashnod gave a short bob of the head as well. "We are honored by your invitation," said Mishra, rising. Again. The smile on his face could be earnest, thought Tawnos, or it could be the pasted-on smile of a fallagy trader. "We are honored by your presence," said Urza, though his words sounded to Tawnos's ears dry and bloodless. "Is your Qadir with you?" "Alas," said Mishra, bowing again deeply, "I fear that his most wise and earnest presence could not accompany us on our mission of peace and mercy. Our empire is wide now, and there are other matters that require his attention." Urza was silent for a moment, and Tawnos could see the muscles tighten along his jawline. "We should have been told if your leader was otherwise occupied," he said at last. "We understand your disappointment," replied Mishra quickly. "Be assured that it is shared by our most puissant and powerful master. I will not heed to you, brother. After his last experience with your people, he wishes to be cautious. He has entrusted to me the power to negotiate fully on his behalf. However, if we are unwelcome because of his absence, we apologize and will humbly retreat the way we came." He bowed a third time. Tawnos realized the younger brother was not making his exaggerated movements for Urza, but rather for the large number of Yotians lining the walls. Even if the chief artificer had wanted to, he could not now send the fallagy representatives away. Tawnos held his face in a mask of solemn indifference, as he had back when as a lad he listened to his uncle speak. He kept his eyes forward, looking past Mishra into the middle distance. After a few moments he realized he was looking at Ashnod over her master's left shoulder. She too had the impassive look on her face of a child who is expected to behave herself while the parents talk. Tawnos blinked, realizing the red-haired woman might think he was staring at her, and moved his gaze a few feet to the left, toward one of the wheels of the great metal wain. As he did so, Ashnod caught his eye and winked. It was a flutter, accompanied by the ghost of a smile. Tawnos started, his eyes darting back to the scarlet-haired woman. But by that time, her face was an impassive diplomatic mask. All this occurred in the time it took for Urza to respond. "You are welcome as the representative of your people," he said. "Let me present you to the queen, if you will follow me." A brief bow here, and Mishra added softly, "And let me say, you are looking well, brother. I would have been heartbroken if you had perished at Kolinda." "It is," began Urza, and paused. The world seemed to turn around him for a moment, then he continued, "It is good to know you are safe as well." "About Kolinda?" Mishra held up a hand. "We can speak of the matter at length. Let me say that I have given it much thought over the past year. We will talk. But for the moment, we should not keep your queen waiting." Urza's face tightened for a moment, then relaxed, and he nodded. "Of course." With that he spun on his heel and walked back toward the gate. Mishra followed, accompanied by the woman. Tawnos brought up the rear. The red-haired woman hesitated as she passed the apprentice. She turned slightly, and said, "You must be Tawnos." She held out her hand. Automatically Tawnos took her fingers and bowed slightly over them. "I'm sorry." "Yes, I'm Tawnos, apprentice to Urza." "You are Mishra's chief apprentice, Ashnod." Ashnod withdrew her hand, and again a small smile played over her face. "Chief and only," she said. "It's typical of those two that they wouldn't bother to introduce us. Brilliant Mishra is, but he sometimes has the social graces of an Atog." It must run in the family, eh? Tawnos tried to form a response, but by the time he had thought of something relatively innocuous, she had turned back and was following the two brothers toward the gate. Tawnos shook his head slightly and brought up the rear, arriving at the gate as Urza was presenting Kayla, rolling off her various titles like a schoolmaster reading the roll, Flower of the Marden, Warlord's daughter, Queen of the Yosians and Warlady of Krug, my wife, Caleb Krug, concluded Urza. Mishra, the chosen representative of the fansThe. The Kadir was unable to attend and begs our forgiveness. Tawnos noted that Urza was looking at the seneschal as he said it, and that the nervous man flinched at the implied accusation. Kayla offered her hand to the younger brother. Urza spoke to me of your beauty, said Mishra, bowing deeply over her hand. But I had forgotten his capacity for understatement. For him a majestic tree is only so many broad feet of lumber, and a desert vista only so many miles to cross. So, too, I see that he has seriously unvalued your charm. A small smile played across Kayla's face. Tawnos thought the queen was amused, though she had long since become immune to fulsome praise. Urza had spoken of his brother, she said, but I must admit that I was unprepared for one so eloquent. I have few regrets in life, said Mishra, still grasping the queen's hand lightly, and one of them is that I never had a sister. With you as my brother's wife, that is now remedied. With that he loosened her hand, and she gently withdrew it. There were other introductions, Ashnod, Tawnos the seneschal, and the captain of the guard, and arrangements were made for the fansThe to bivouac around the dragon engine. But the part that Tawnos remembered later, after it was all said and done, was the stony stare with which Urza favored his younger brother as Mishra flattered Kayla, and Mishra's toothy white smile as he regarded his brother's wife. Sounds of the fight carried all the way down the hall. Tawnos had passed a gaggle of chambermaids speeding away from the royal quarters. Then he heard the arguing voices reverberate like steel balls against the surrounding walls. Closer still, the air itself gained weight and potency. He felt as if he were back on the seacoast watching a squall wade ashore, pushing the air in front of it. Undeterred, he pressed forward. The door to the quarters was shut, but that did little to blunt the noises from within. This close, Tawnos could make out words, and he paused a moment before knocking. The answer is no, shouted Urza. It's a good trade, rejoined Kayla just as loudly. They will leave the sword marchers alone. It's not yours to trade away, thundered Urza. Tawnos had never heard the chief artificer that loud before, even when he was bawling out the most incompetent of apprentices. Tawnos hesitated at the door. Would it be better to interrupt and make them aware that the fight was resounding through the palace, or to wait for a lull in the shouting? Tawnos knocked. There was a testy growl of what for the other side, coupled with a more feminine, disciplined enter. Tawnos entered the room cautiously and said, the fansThe delegation is waiting for the tour of the ornery chief artificer. Urza shot his apprentice a look as frosty as the Ronim glacier. Yes, thought Tawnos, this was a particularly bad time to interrupt. Across the room, Kayla was standing, hands folded in front of her. In the Privy Council, that usually meant that a particular subject was closed. If you want me to conduct the tour, added Tawnos, but Urza already had his hand up. I'll be there, said the chief artificer, as Tawnos knew he Would. The idea of his brother padding through his research area without Urza being present was unthinkable. To his wife, Urza snapped, "This discussion is not over, my wife." Kayla nodded curtly. "You are correct, my husband." Urza gave a sharp half-bow and left the room. Kayla said, "Tawnos, remain a moment." Tawnos looked at the chief artificer. Urza scowled, then gave Tawnos a nod. "Come along when you can," he said, and then he was gone, his formal cape billowing behind him. Tawnos turned back to the Queen. "Your Majesty," he said. Then added, "Ma'am, you heard our discussion out in the hall," she said. Tawnos took a deep breath. "I think they heard your discussion in the domes of Tomikul." Kayla smiled and slumped into one of her chairs, a heavy, throne-like monster with ornately carved arms. "I did not hear much of it," continued Tawnos quickly. "The stonework carries the intensity but not the nature of your words." Kayla laced her hands, templed her fingers, and touched them to her lips. "Would you say the talks have gone well these past few days?" "Very well," replied Tawnos. And indeed, they had verged on phenomenal, considering the abortive talks in Corlinda. Gifts had been presented, toasts had been exchanged, platitudes had been spoken, and effusive compliments had been offered. Private meetings between Kayla and Mishra had led to discussions among the falange and in the Privy Council. The good feelings between the two sides had culminated in Urza's offer to show his brother his ornery. In return, Mishra had offered to let Urza and his assistant look at the dragon engine and Great Wayne. Things were going very well indeed. "And Ambassador Mishra?" asked Kayla. "Your opinion of him?" Tawnos hesitated, unsure of what Kayla wanted to know. "He is." The apprentice searched for words. "He is like his brother. Only different. More effusive. More willing to talk. But no less guarded," said Kayla. Tawnos thought for a moment. Yes, despite all the talk and praise and compliments, Mishra remained even more closed than his brother. He seemed earnest, but was his earnestness the truth or only a mask? Tawnos realized he would never think of Urza in that fashion. "I rarely know what Urza is thinking, but that is because he is quiet. I don't know what Mishra is thinking, because he is talking." Kayla gave a small smile and said, "He is very charming, and I have heard that the desert traders have the ability to talk a snake out of its skin. Do you think he has the ability to enforce any deal made here?" Tawnos nodded. "He brought the dragon engine with him. The men who follow him apparently think well of him." Kayla was silent for a moment, then said, "Do you think we can trust him?" Tawnos held up his hands. "I don't think we have given him much chance to prove our trust so far." "Indeed," said Kayla, and pressed her fingers to her lips. "What if I were to tell you that Mishra was prepared to sign a treaty recognizing Yosha's claim to the sword marches?" Amazed, Tawnos said, "The Qadir is willing to do this." Kayla held up a finger. "I said, what if? Diplomacy is filled with what-ifs, idle ideas that are launched. If they fail to fly, they are quickly denied and more quickly forgotten. Like prototypes in the ornery," smiled Tawnos, and he thought about the nature of the offer. What would be the price for such a boon? Kayla nodded. "Their declared price involves protection of falange natives among our populace, guards for the caravans within our land, and a token payment for the land seized, but no formal apology for seizing it, along with a recognition of the Qadir as ruler of the United Fallaji people. In national terms, these are very small things indeed. But there is one last piece, and that is the sticking point. Kayla was quiet for a moment, and Tawnos did not interrupt. The pause. When she spoke again, it was in cool tones. What are the abilities of Urza's stone? The one he wears around his neck. His Mightstone, said Tawnos. Light broke over him. Mishra wants his brother's talisman. What does it do? Persisted Kayla. He is rarely without it. Tawnos thought about what he had seen Urza do with the stone. Slowly he replied, it seems to make artifacts and creatures more powerful within a limited range. He uses it to heal flawed power crystals, but it seems to work that way only in his hands. And he holds it when he is thinking, though that may be just force of habit. Good sir, Mishra has his own stone, made to his brothers, said Kayla. Has he told you that? Tawnos was silent for a moment, then shook his head. I was surprised at that as well, the more so that it was Mishra who told me, said Kayla, a ripple of irritation evident in her voice. So the stone has some power, and Mishra wants it. Mishra said his stone sang to him. Does Urza's stone sing? Not that I have noticed, said Tawnos. Nor one, agreed Kayla. The ambassador may be using some desert idiom I am not familiar with, so it may just be a flowery illusion. Yet the fact remains that Mishra is willing to guarantee peace, backed by his dragon engine and other devices. He has hinted at all if Urza will give up his stone. Tawnos shook his head. Urza would not do this, I think. You think correctly, said Kayla gloomily. Hence the discussion that shook the halls of this palace. The Queen of Yosha placed her palms together, fingers extended, and twisted them a quarter turn against each other. Then back. It struck Tawnos that he had seen Urza use the same mannerism when faced with a problem in design. He wondered if the Queen had picked up the habit from her prince consort, or the chief artificer from his royal wife. I do not think it would do the nation harm if Mishra was to get the other half of his stone, she said. But it might do Urza harm, replied Tawnos. In doing so, it could harm the nation. Agreed, said Kayla, again twisting her palms against each other, then setting them down in her lap. But can I let this opportunity pass by? Am I condemning the sword marches to continual raids and the rest of the country to a constant military footing because of an item coveted by both brothers? Tawnos was silent for a moment, then said, Urza is right. Kayla's face fell, but Tawnos added, you both need to talk more on this subject. You aren't Urza. You aren't Mishra. Mishra and Urza themselves. Perhaps there is some common ground that frees the sword marches. Perhaps Mishra is merely testing the waters, trying the prototype of an idea to see what your reaction is. Perhaps he asks for the stone and will settle for something else. Something you don't know he wants yet. Kayla sighed. These are the problems of rulership. There are some situations that resist all easy solutions, which is why I am trying to avoid providing you with any, said Tawnos. Kayla nodded. Your talents are wasted as Urza's apprentice. Tawnos. You would make an excellent seneschal. Tawnos winced comically. You already have an excellent seneschal. And were I not Urza's apprentice, who would you talk to about the prince consort? That sally brought a true smile to Caleb Krug's face. Agreed. Now be off with you. But be sure to tell me later how the brothers are getting along. Tawnos rejoined the chief artificer at the ornery as Urza was explaining the better control of the wing surface with a double bend structure. Mishra was attentive and seemed to ask all the right questions, leading Urza each time into his next point. Urza, for his part, was scholarly but not pedantic about his work. To Tawnos there seemed to be no friction between the brothers, and he deemed it likely that the subject of the stone had not arisen on either side. Tawnos looked around. Most of the rest of the falange seemed bored beyond human conception, and the students present had heard most of Urza's explanations before. They were staring at odd bits of the ornery, trying to keep from falling asleep. Ashnod, however, was watching Tawnos. When he looked her way, she turned her head back to where the two brothers were discussing. Then, as soon as he turned away, he could feel the pressure of her eyes on him. It made him very uncomfortable. Tawnos had assumed from what Urza had said that Ashnod was Mishra's lover as well as his student. Yet the two did not behave as intimates, and that earlier wink, if it were truly a wink, and now these stares that were not stares, told a different story entirely. The talk lasted through most of the early afternoon. Mishra made a number of small suggestions of his own concerning the design, while Urza pointed out what other changes they would necessitate. Finally it became clear they would not have time to tour the Dragon engine as well that evening, and indeed there would be much rushing about if that evening's state dinner was to go off as planned. Mishra was effusive in his apologies. I can see that you've achieved much here. Once there is peace, I hope to be able to establish my own small foundry and laboratory, he said. When you do, responded Urza, let me send you the notes on my teaching experiences. I discovered that certain methods work better than others in holding the attention of young men. As if we never had that problem when we were young, said Mishra with a laugh, and Urza managed a tight smile. Yes, thought Tawnos, Urza had not entirely forgotten the argument with Kayla, but he was not going to let it spill out before his brother. It would not be he who created an incident, not he who spoiled his wife's hopes for peace. The state dinner was held within the great courtyard, an open-air celebration in the falange style to honor the guests. Every cushion and throw rug in the palace was pressed into service, and a fine repast of roast lamb and spiced chicken was laid out for the attendees, who sprawled alongside low tables. The falange, after too many suppers in stiff-backed chairs, were notably at ease, whereas the Yotians continually shifted and moved to find suitable resting places. The seneschal had found a band of Muharan musicians in the city who had no qualms about playing for members of the Suwardi clan, and the air was filled with their high-pitched strings and hearty shouts. Kayla sat with Urza on one side of her, Mishra on the other. She spoke with both, though she was mostly attentive to her husband, at one point offering him a date stuffed with cheese. He did not let her feed him, but rather took the fruit from her hand and smiled at her, popping the treat into his mouth. Those city folk who watched the royal couple were no doubt delighted by their display of affection. To Tawnos it was a sign that perhaps the storm in their private quarters had blown over. Mishra, for his part, when talking to Kayla, continually extolled some virtue or another of desert life. The meal ran 8 courses in the Yotian tradition, but all the courses were of falange dishes. In addition to the lamb and chicken, there was a broiled fish done with hot peppers, salads of spinach and goat cheese, and all manner of salted meats. Everything was served with a pungent wine smelling of cinnamon. The wine, called Nabis, was as potent as it was pungent, and Tawnos noted that a number of the Yotians used it to offset the discomforts of sprawling across the pillows. Most of his table consisted of falange lieutenants, who laughed among themselves. And once, when a recognizable tune appeared from the band, rose to engage in a long line dance. Mishra joined them, keeping pace with the kicks and flourishes. A shadow moved along Tawnos's side. "Interesting, no?" asked Ashnod, as she settled down next to Tawnos. "Traditional warriors dance," replied Tawnos. Ashnod held out her cup, one of the gold ones from the warlord's 10th anniversary celebration. Tawnos reached for the ewe of Nabis and refilled the goblet. Ashnod made a rude noise at Tawnos's words. "It's one more boys-only tradition," she said with a slight slur in her voice. And Tawnos wondered how much wine she had had already. The falange are typically chauvinist, and the Suwardi the worst of the pack. Mishra had to practically club the Qadir over the head to agree to negotiate with the woman in the first place. Women should be out raising the children and baking flatbread, not getting involved in politics, war, religion, science, or any of the rest of that boys' stuff. Single quote quote. Tawnos did not let his surprise at Ashnod's words show. "Times change for all of us," he said. "Perhaps the falange will change as well." "Not in my lifetime or in yours," returned Ashnod. She pressed a slim hand against her bare breastbone and stifled a burp. "They're here, negotiating with a woman, and things are going well. And you, a woman, are among their number," Tawnos said. "I am merely tolerated," replied the red-haired woman. "I am Mishra's apprentice and assistant. The great Mishra is as much the leader of the falange now as the Qadir, and the chiefs trust him more than they do the fat young pup currently running things. So they put up with me. And the falange legends say things about dangerous women with red hair." She set down her cup and ran both hands through her long tresses, arching her back as she did so. "So they fear me as well." "Should they?" asked Tawnos. He knew he was feeling the effects of the Nabis work through his system as well, but he could not suppress his interest in this woman. "Fear me," said Ashnod with a devilish smile. "I'd like to think so. But if Mishra left him tomorrow, I would be gone as well before nightfall, of that I have no doubt." Tawnos made no comment and instead looked at the dancers. Most of the falange had joined the dance, which had transformed from a line into a spiral curling in on itself. Mishra led the procession and had enticed the spindly seneschal to accompany him. The bird-like man tried to mimic Mishra's steps and did an admirable job miming the steps, bows, and shouts. Other members of the palace staff had joined the procession, but both unfamiliarity and spiced wine worked against them, reducing them to mere shufflers in the procession. The falange did not seem to mind, and in fact seemed to spur them to increased gyrations and bellows. "Things are going very well," said Tawnos. "Better than you could imagine," said Ashnod softly. "What did you think of the ornery?" asked Tawnos. "More impressive than I expected," replied Ashnod, shaking her hair back. "Master Mishra is jealous. You know. Not that he'd admit it, but he's been talking about getting a place to set up his own work for years. I think that's why he wants this peace treaty. He's been recruiting artisans from Tomikul and Zegon, but he has no permanent place for them. Tawnos nodded. Ashnod was sharing more than she should, but he had no problems listening to her. Still, he said, it is a pity we ran long at the ornery. I would have liked to have examined. Tawnos stared into her stormy eyes and almost lost his thought. Mishra's dragon engine, he finished lamely. Who's to say you can't? Asked Ashnod. Well, there is always tomorrow, said Tawnos. Ashnod shook her head. Not tomorrow. Tonight. Tawnos stared at her. There's a banquet going on later, said Ashnod. Listen. Can you get past the Yoshan guards on our wing of the palace? Tawnos thought for a moment. They know me. I don't think there would be a problem. And I can get past the brass hats guarding the engine, said the woman, shaking her head again. They know me and fear me. Remember, I can give you a private tour. Interested? Tawnos stammered for a moment, and Ashnod added, come on. We're supposed to be students. That means we can occasionally play hooky. You've never played hooky? Never, said Tawnos, and realized he was blushing. Well, hardly ever. You. Ashnod's face became suddenly stern, mocking her companion. Never, she said in a low, masculine tone, then smiled and winked. A definite wink this time. Well, hardly ever. So, are you interested? Tawnos realized that it might be an opportunity to gain additional insights into Mishra for the Queen and the Chief Artificer. Yes, he said at last. I think I'd like that. Dandy, said Ashnod, rising smoothly from her seat without a sign of the effects of the alcohol she had been consuming. After the midnight bell, then come to my quarters and bring a civilized, decent, dry wine, will you? All this desert wine is like liquefied candy. With that she was gone, disappearing along the edges of the cluster of drunken Phalagian Yoshans, all bellowing and shuffling to the music, forming an ever-growing maelstrom of celebrants. Chapter 14. Night Moves. Tawnos picked out a white wine from the larder's private stock, which the palace cook assured him was the finest vintage the Corliss vineyards had produced in 100 years. Still, Urza's apprentice felt more like a spy than a scholar with a jug of wine. As an afterthought, he picked up his yarrow-wood serpent, the one that had impressed Urza years ago. He wound the toy's spring, set the latch, and put the coiled wooden snake in his pocket. Off across the city, the midnight bell was tolling. Servants would be clearing the banquet by now, and those revelers not capable of making it back to the quarters would be rolled to a convenient corner and covered with a blanket until morning. Urza and Kayla had left arm in arm, their heads bent together in conversation. Mishra had completed one last dance with his men, then bade them return to the encampment. He and Ashnod would be staying at the quarters provided in the palace. At the time, Tawnos thought that the availability of soft beds and running water had something to do with that decision. After talking to Ashnod, Tawnos had stopped drinking the nabis. However, the other drink being offered was a thick, syrupy coffee served in small cups. The mixture turned his stomach slightly, and left him feeling nervous. At least Tawnos hoped that it was only the coffee and the nabis that had unsettled his stomach. Tawnos paused at the hallway leading to the guest quarters. then changed direction, heading instead for the ornery at the far end of the palace. It was only past midnight. Urza would still be awake and could tell him what to look for in particular. When inspecting the metallic beast, the apprentice arrived to discover Kayla quietly backing out and closing the door of the ornery, watching into the workshop. As she did so, she gave a small jump when she saw Tawnos standing there, then raised a finger to her lips. "He's resting," she whispered. "It is early for him," said Tawnos quietly. "It's been a long day," she said, "and a good one." "For him?" "Yes," said Tawnos. "He and his brother seem to be getting along." Kayla pushed a loose strand of hair back, and a small smile broke across her face. "Yes, that," she said, "among other things. In any event, I don't think you should disturb him for a little while." Tawnos nodded, suddenly aware that he was carrying a bottle of white wine with him. Fortunately, Kayla did not say anything about it. Regardless, he shifted the jug slightly behind him and asked about the discussion you two had earlier. Kayla shrugged and moved away from the door. "We've talked. We had a good talk." "And what did he say?" asked Tawnos. Kayla hesitated for a moment, then said, "He didn't say no." Tawnos gave a sage nod. "Well, that's a start." "A good start," agreed Kayla. "Now, I think we both have other places to be at the moment." Tawnos blushed slightly. Of course the Queen had seen a bottle, and made the assumption he had some late-night rendezvous. Tomorrow he would tell her the truth of the matter, and the nature of the dragon engine. For the moment, he merely bowed and retreated back toward the guest wing. The guest quarters consisted of a separate wing of the palace. Of Krug and Ashnod and her master had been placed on separate floors, each in a huge encampment of suites. A hand-picked group of servants, known for their open ears and shut mouths, had been assigned to the wing, along with a number of loyal guards. The Phalangi were allowed to keep their own bodyguards, with the understanding that they too would be under guard. After the second night, Mishra had dismissed his own guards as a sign of his trust in their hosts. Their arrangements were very Krugian in nature. Each offer of beneficence concealed some implicit method of control. Tawnos wondered how much of it was Urza's doing, and decided that there was little involving his brother's visit that the chief artificer was not aware of. The guards raised their short pikes to let him pass. Tawnos knocked, and the unlatched door opened beneath his knock. Ashnod was working at the table, fitting wires around an animal skull, which had been affixed to her dark wooden staff. She held up a hand as Tawnos entered. "One moment," she said, and looped a small strand through the skull's nostrils. "There. Done." She looked up. There was a curious fire in her eyes that Tawnos had seen before. He had seen it in Urza's eyes when he was working on a new refinement of an invention, and in the mirror when he himself was helping the chief artificer. Ashnod blinked and the fire banked for the moment, but now that Tawnos had seen it in its full glory, he could still detect it. "Just a little project I've been puttering with," she said, setting the staff aside. Tawnos looked at the staff and noted that the animal skull fit snugly over the end. "Anything you need help with?" he offered. Ashnod shook her head. "Just a craft to keep my hands busy." Then her eyes lit up. You've brought the wine. I'll get the goblets. We'll do a toast, and then take the jug with us to the engine." Tawnos set the wine down on the table and seated himself at a bench. I hope that this is not too late. Not late at all, said Ashnod, saluting the other apprentice. With a pair of brass cups, the stems crossed and clenched in her small fist. I'm used to working on Mishra's time. He's up early and to bed very, very late. The chief artificer is much the same, said Tawnos, pouring the wine. I've learned to catnap. Ashnod took her cup. I never could do that. But that thick coffee they drink in the desert, Sandak, works for me. 1 cup. And I can stay awake for a day and night. Then I fall into a coma from exhaustion. Tawnos rubbed the back of his neck. He had had no less than 4 of the small cups at dinner. Ashnod raised her goblet. A toast to the madmen who are masters. Tawnos blinked. Madmen. Ashnod lowered her cup slightly. To Mishra and Urza, she suggested. To the brother artificers, responded Tawnos, and returned the toast. Both took a sip of the wine. Tawnos had never cared for the smell or taste of white wine, but after the heavily spiced meal and pungent drinks it was a godsend. Ashnod took the seat opposite the tawny-haired apprentice. So you don't think our masters are mad? Well, divinely inspired sometimes, said Tawnos. But mad. There is a fine line between the two, noted Ashnod. Can we say that the gods on madness control them? How many times has your Urza suggested something completely irrational only to be proven correct? Tawnos shrugged. I always assumed he had a reason for his actions, even if he did not share it with me. Humph, said Ashnod. I thought it was a tradition that apprentices always complained about their masters. You were a toy maker, I hear. Didn't you complain about the master toy maker then? Well, the master toy maker of Joralan was my uncle, Sarai. Never, said Tawnos, then stopped as Ashnod broke out in peals of laughter. Ashnod must have read the disappointment in Tawnos' face, because she quickly cut her chuckling short. You sound like a baby duck always following along behind its mother duck. Such loyalty is so sweet. So your first master was a relative, and your new master is? Tawnos shrugged. He is Urza. He knows more than anyone else I've ever met. Ashnod looked at Tawnos and said in a low voice, gods below, you're serious, aren't you? Tawnos shrugged again. Sure. Why have a a superior, who doesn't know more than you do? But you know things he doesn't, right? Said Ashnod, motioning with her now empty cup. Well, yes, said Tawnos, pouring the wine for her, and then, as an afterthought, topping off his own goblet. But other important matters, he knows more than I do. And that's why we stay with them, then. They know more than we do, said Ashnod. In part, said Tawnos, leaning back. A small part. I mean, Urza is demanding, and precise and hard to follow sometimes when he's hot on an idea. Mishra's the same way, said Ashnod. And you get the idea that when he explains something to you, it's as if he's reining himself in, choosing simple words and small ideas that you can understand. And he expects you to keep up with him. Tawnos chuckled now. That's Urza sometimes. You saw the wind chamber in the ornery. Urza had it built so students could prove their modifications of the ornithopters would not work, saving him the trouble of explaining it and the trouble of building a full working model. Or non-working model, said Ashnod, and Tawnos smiled at that. Like I said earlier at the feast, Mishra really envies the sense of place that your brother has. Big palace. School with assistants. Regular supplies. She paused for a moment, then added beautiful wife. Tawnos responded, there are things in Mishra's life that Urza envies. There's the dragon engine, of course. He does, said Ashnod, looking over her cup. Urza said that once you get away from machinery, Urza doesn't say much, replied Tawnos, but you understand his moods, his looks, what he talks about, and more importantly, what he doesn't talk about. Ditto for Master Mishra, said Ashnod. Or rather, he talks, but he avoids certain subjects, and you can tell what's on his mind by what he doesn't talk about. It appears like a genie in the center of the whirlwind. Right, said Tawnos, and Urza feels that Mishra has a greater sense of freedom sometimes. Urza feels that he has to be so responsible for everything, and the desert offers freedom. What's so funny? Nothing, said Ashnod, stifling a giggle. But it's amusing that the fallagy are currently in the iron grip of a petulant child man. If you think the desert means freedom, you've never met the Qadir. I think Urza would much rather be working on artifacts than trying to support a nation, said Tawnos. Agreed for Mishra as well, said Ashnod, raising her goblet in another toast. It's the love of artifacts that binds them together, and probably us to them as well. There's something about getting beneath the skin of a new device, understanding a new concept, agreed Tawnos. Unlocking its inner secrets, understanding the design philosophy behind it, feeling its power, comprehending its purpose, said Tawnos, and expanding its abilities. Ashnod laughed again, and it was a relaxed laugh. There are so very few of us, you know. I'm one of the few that can talk to Mishra and understand him. I feel much the same way with Urza, said Tawnos, as an afterthought, and with you as well. I won't try to use small words, said Ashnod. I'll try to keep up, said Tawnos. It's all so difficult, said Ashnod. I mean, I feel doubly walled away from everything. First, a powerful woman among the fallagy is an exception, not a rule. And second, being an intelligent being among the desert people is so frustrating, suggested Tawnos. Exactly, said Ashnod. Pour me another. We should see the engine, said Tawnos. There's time, she said. Time for everything in the world. Tawnos poured, and said, I went back to Joralan a few months ago, and was telling my aunts and uncles what I was doing. And they were very polite and appreciative, but I don't think they understood my work at all. At least they were appreciative, said Ashnod. I get hostile stares from the Suwardi. But it was the same at Zegon. At first I thought it was because I was a woman, but then people were distant because I was smarter than everyone else. It's frustrating to be smart. It separates you from the rest of the populace. It is difficult being different, Tawnos admitted. And I bet the continual work keeps you away from your family. Your friends, said Ashnod. Your wife. I'm not married, said Tawnos. It wasn't you I was talking about, said Ashnod. But you don't even have a regular young lady, I'll bet. Well, I have been busy, said Tawnos defensively. I rest my case, said Ashnod, slapping the tabletop with the fleshy part of her palm. Just like Mother Duck Urza. You're working for the most powerful man in Yosha and you don't have the girls flocking to you. Tawnos shrugged. What about you? Among the falange? Ha! She slapped the table again. I really think they have to have a breeding program to produce such oafs. What about Mishra? Asked Tawnos. Ashnod's chuckle died. Mishra, she said, and her eyes grew a bit misted. Early on, yes. But it wasn't as much a relationship as it was a power thing. Sort of who can control who. And it got old fast, and soon he was back to worrying about his precious engines. I don't like playing second to machinery. Tawnos nodded. So there had been a relationship between Mishra and his pupil, but that was apparently in the past. But there was something else in her words that he almost missed. Engines? Asked Tawnos. Pardon? Ashnod blinked. You said he worries about his engines, said Tawnos. Plural. Ashnod pulled up short. There's the dragon engine. And the great wane it's pulling. The falange call that engine a war machine, but Mishra told everyone to not refer to it as such during the talks. It might make the Yotians nervous. Aha, said Tawnos, filing away that bit of information for later. Perhaps a tour of the war machine was in order as well. Tawnos decided to push a little further. They obviously weren't going to get to the dragon engine until the wine was gone, and perhaps not even then. So does Mishra have the power to enforce a peace? If he wants it, yes, said Ashnod. The Kadir will whine and moan, but most of the lesser sheikhs already back Mishra. The tribal chieftains want it all one way or another. Either the glories of war or the bliss of peace, without a middle ground. They're like machines that way. Easy to command and control. So what does Mishra truly want? Said Tawnos. I mean, Urza can help with him establishing his own school, if that's his goal. Ashnod shook her head. The falange way is not to accept aid, or gifts, or charity. It is to take what they want, their trade, or force of arms, or guile, or whatever else is required. The old warlord figured that out, but I don't think good Queen Kayla has a clue. Tawnos frowned. Mishra is not falange. He is Argivian, like Urza. Ashnod counted. Mishra has lived among the falange and come to lead them. He understands their ways better than Urza understands the Yotians. No, Mishra at his heart is jealous of his brother and wants what belongs to him. Tawnos thought of his discussion with Kayla earlier in the day. The stone. Ashnod nodded. The stone. Mishra told me the one he carried was once a larger stone, split into through his brother's actions. Did Urza tell you the same? Tawnos worked his mouth, but no sound came out. We never talked about it, and I never thought to ask. Baby duck. Spat Ashnod. Mishra envies his brother his soft life and laboratory and beautiful wife. That's true. But what he really wants is the stone. Is it worth trading away the sword marches for it? Asked Tawnos. It's worth talking about trading the sword marches for it, laughed Ashnod. The falange get what they want by war, guile. And if everything's gone well enough, he's already succeeded. Ashnod realized at once that she had said too much and put a hand over her mouth. At last she said, I shouldn't say anything else about that. Diplomatic secrets and all that. We should go see the dragon engine. Tawnos rose, his mind running through the events of the past day. Meeting Kayla outside the ornery. The fact she was doting on Urza at the banquet where earlier they were going at it. Hammer and tongs. The fact that she was insistent Tawnos get along and not bother Urza. They both had places to be, she had said. He didn't say no, she had said. I have to go, Tawnos said. Ashnod rose across from him. We have all night. I think I need to talk to Urza, he said. It's late even for Urza, said Ashnod. Perhaps if I accompanied you. Hopefully not too late, muttered Tawnos, and paused by the door. He turned and said, You'll have to stay here, I'm afraid. This has been a very interesting evening, and I hope that I'm wrong about what I'm thinking, because I would like to talk to you again later. And with that he was gone, and the short pikes of the guards were visible as the door swung shut. Ashnod shook her head behind him, cradling her brass goblet in one hand. Outside, Tawnos was shouting for the guards to find Ambassador Mishra. Said too much, she thought. And too soon. She shook her head and drained the goblet of the last of the wine. Then she went to her jewelry box and removed a pair of earrings. She pried the iridescent stones from them and put the skull-headed staff back on the table. Slowly but with practiced skill, she started to fit the small power stones into the skull's eyes. Tawnos had to shake Urza awake. The chief artificer did not rouse when his apprentice burst into the ornery, nor when he called his name. There was an overturned ewer of the pungent wine on the floor, but only a thin stream issued from its wide mouth. Similarly, a pair of half-empty goblets left sweating circles on the plans on the work desk. Urza was curled up tightly in a blanket, snoring softly on the day cot he would use when working. Later, when fighting with Kayla, Tawnos shook Urza's shoulder hard, and the artificer was awake in a moment, sitting bolt upright, his eyelids beating rapidly to blink back the sleep. Tawnos. What? Is there a fire? What's wrong? Beneath the blanket, Urza was half-dressed, and those clothes he was wearing were bunched together in odd shapes. Tawnos looked at Urza and said, Sir, your stone. Instinctively Urza's fingers went to his chest, where the stone normally hung. They closed on empty air. Immediately he raised the hand to touch his neck, but the chain that hung there was missing. The stone, he said, the last dregs of sleep banished from his eyes, replaced by a hot fire. Where is it? He immediately began tearing up the bedclothes and blankets. Sir, said Tawnos, I ran into your wife as she was leaving. Here. Kayla, said Urza, looking up. Then his face turned stern. Kayla, he said again, a dagger's edge in his voice. Urza became a flurry of action, gathering his banquet regalia into some semblance of order. He grabbed the cape, looking for the loops, then abandoned it entirely, cursing and flinging it across the room. Then he was at the door, bellowing for Tawnos to follow. Tawnos was taller than Urza, and should have been able to catch up to the smaller man easily. But Urza moved as if he was an ornithopter incarnate, gliding through the halls at inhuman speed, passing the guards like they were no more than ghosts. Tawnos was himself stopped by guards from the guest wing, who informed him that Mishra was not in his quarters. A full search of the wing revealed nothing, they added. Would Tawnos want him to seal the palace and send a runner to the Fallagy encampment to determine if Mishra had returned there? Tawnos hastily agreed. But by the time he concluded this brief conversation, Urza had vanished ahead of him. There were shouts again from the royal quarters as Tawnos approached, but this time both of the voices were male and booming. In addition, this time the door was open, nearly ripped from its hinges, and Tawnos thought it opened with a sharp kick, as opposed to a twist of the latch. From the doorway issued an ever-changing spectrum of light. Tawnos paused in the doorway and raised a hand to peer past the light. It issued from Urza's Mightstone, and from Mishra's gem as well, forming the poles of a magnet with the light itself acting like metal filings stretched between them. Urza had regained his stone, and now was snarling at his brother across the room. Mishra was shouting something else incomprehensible back at him, the warm smile of the Fallagy ambassador replaced with a feral snarl. Their words were lost in an angry humming of energy between the two stones. Between them, against the far wall, was Caleb Krug. Tawnos noticed that Urza was not the only one who had dressed in a rush. Mishra's clothes were in an equal disarray, and the queen had a sheet wrapped around her torso, clutched at her chest. She saw Tawnos, and her face shone with relief. She said something that Tawnos could not hear over the throbbing pulses of the battling stones. She took a step forward toward him. Tawnos threw up his hands and shouted for her to stay back. Whatever was happening between the stones, and between the brothers, involved energies he neither recognized nor trusted. It could have been Tawnos's shout, or his wave of his arms. Or it could have been seeing Kayla stepping almost into the energies between the two stones. Or it could have been a moment of weakness on Urza's part. But Urza dropped his stone. Only for an instant, and he still gripped it in his hand. But he dropped his stone, and it was enough. A violent rainbow of energy spewed forth from Mishra's stone and slammed into Urza. The lanky chief artificer was bodily lifted up by the force of the blow and flung backward against the armoire, breaking the doors of that cabinet inward from the impact. Then suddenly the energy from Mishra's stone went out, and it was as if those within the room were suddenly plunged into the dark. So great was the magnitude of difference in the light. Tawnos blinked and started toward where he knew Urza lay. Someone heavy and burly, Mishra, he realized later, slammed into him, brushing past him and out the door. Kayla was at Urza's side already, crying as she knelt next to his prostrate form. Urza's eyes were open, but showed only the whites, and his breath was shallow and frothy, still clenched in his hand was his Mightstone, a rainbow of colors leaking between his fingers. "The temple amulets," said Tawnos to Kayla. "The ones Urza made. Do you have one here? Perhaps we can." Kayla was nodding, but neither had time to finish their thoughts. The stone clenched in Urza's hand began to pulse more, to flash through the spectrum, and into ranges that Tawnos felt more than saw. Slowly, Urza's other hand raised and grasped the stone, and his breathing became more regular. His eyes closed, and when they opened again, they were normal. No, they were not normal, Tawnos realized. They were filled with emotion, filled with rage. Urza got up. Kayla tried to restrain him, to tell him that he should rest until the temple priests arrived, but he brought up an arm to ward her off. He brought it up too hard and too fast, for he knocked Kayla with it. She sprawled backward, and Tawnos rose with his superior, putting a hand out to Urza's shoulder. Urza batted the offered hand away. "Where is he?" he snarled. His hair was a tangle, and Urza looked more like a madman than an Artificer. Tawnos said nothing, but looked at the door. Urza was striding toward it at once. Kayla shouted after him, but he did not look back. Kayla was sobbing now, her tears staining the sheet gathered in front of her. "I tried," she said, then took a deep breath. "I tried to do the best thing for my country, Tawnos." Tawnos could not think of anything to say, but there were more shouts in the hallway. Tawnos helped Kayla to her feet. "Get something on and bring guards," he said, and was out of the doorway as well. There was a great clamor toward the guest wing, and Tawnos thought that Urza had found his brother all too quickly. There were shouts and screams and an unearthly flickering of light. He ran for the wing, hoping to prevent any fatalities. Instead of Urza and Mishra, he found Ashnod. She was wielding the staff that she had been working on earlier. Now its eyes glowed with the eldritch nature of power stones, and lightning coursed along the wires that had been spun along the skull. There were several of the guards down along the hallway, most of them clutching their heads and moaning. Ashnod was swinging the staff back and forth, the gold-lit skull trailing a shadow of color. She was unharmed as yet, but sweat cascaded down her neck and shoulders. The leader of the guards was preparing a massed attack, but Tawnos put a hand on his shoulder and indicated that he wanted to try to disarm the woman first. Tawnos stepped into full view, hands raised and empty. Ashnod paused for a moment, then barked, "I want to leave now." "Is there a problem?" Tawnos tried to smile, conscious that he looked as insincere as he felt. "There has been a bit of an incident," he said. "I'm afraid you're going to have to stay for a while." "I'm afraid not," said Ashnod, and brought her staff up, the skull head oozing golden fire. The blow hit Tawnos square in the stomach, and he could feel the pain rush from that center to the extremities. His stomach heaved and he felt the bilious rise of vomit in his throat. Still, he remained on his feet, and grasped at his cloak, trying to find something that would break the effect of the staff's energies. His hand closed around the coiled wooden snake that he had in his pocket. He pulled it out, thumbing the winding latch open as he did so. Stars danced in front of his eyes, but he had a good enough idea of Ashnod's position to throw the snake at her. The wooden serpent flew through the air, uncoiling, rattling, and hissing as it did so. Ashnod shouted something and raised the staff higher against this new attack. Tawnos was moving the moment that Ashnod spared her attention from him. Charging forward, he tackled her hard in the mid-section. The staff pinwheeled away in one direction while the wooden snake scuttled in the other. Ashnod went down in a heap, and the guards were there immediately, their short pikes pointed at her. Tawnos kept his footing, and towered over her, gasping for breath. Ashnod raised her now empty hands in surrender. "Well, it turns out the baby duck has teeth," she said, slowly getting to her feet, the guards surrounding her. "There are new surprises every day."